All right, good morning, folks. This is the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. It is December 8th at 8 a.m. and we are back live on the Guanella CAP PDC docket. I don't have my agenda before me, so I don't really remember the number, but you know what it is. At this point, we are going to continue with questions from commissioners, if there are any, to the applicant. So the first thing we should do is elevate the panel to the panel so that the panel can be available for any additional questions from commissioners.
Mr. Chairman, when it's appropriate, I have a couple of preliminary things.
Okay, just a sec. First, I got ahead of myself. Let's recognize our existence with a roll call.
Mr. Chair, I'm happy to do that.
Go ahead.
Would like. Okay, thank you. Commissioner Robbins.
Here.
Commissioner Cross.
Present.
Commissioner McGowan.
Here.
Commissioner Ackerman.
Here.
Commissioner Messner.
Here.
All right. You have 5 of 7 commissioners. I don't see any of the other commissioners on right now. Mr.
Right.
President.
I do not see Commissioner Oath or Commissioner Bogue at this time. If they do show up, we will recognize their existence as well. One procedural matter would like to call upon AAG Davenport concerning some missives and emails that arrived in commissioners' inboxes overnight.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioners, good morning. I was made aware over the evening that some commissioners received emails from members of the public in regard to this matter, the Guanella CAP, in the evening or possibly this morning. And what I would like to note at this point, and first of all, I'd like to preface my comments by saying I am only referring to this quasi-adjudicatory matter, the hearing on the PDC Guanella CAP. I'm not referring to procedures for other matters like the petition for rulemaking the commission will hear tomorrow. But this commission provided the public with an opportunity to comment in writing both before this hearing began yesterday and orally public comment at the beginning of the hearing yesterday. That was the appropriate time period for public comment. The commission will not accept additional public comment after that time period. And those emails that may have come in to some of you in the evening or this morning after the time period for public comment ended will not be made part of the record and will be disregarded by the commission as it considers the PDC Guanella CAP today.
You're muted, Mr. Chairman.
AAG Davenport, the statement you made is consistent with our rules of procedure.
Yes, it is.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. So would recognize Mr. Lepore for some opening. I don't know what you're about to say, but go for it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everybody. Seems early to me. I actually have a couple of things to say at this point. The first is, Mr. Chairman, yesterday you offered me the opportunity to make a closing statement and I declined. I'd like to take back my answer and make a closing statement with your grace when it's appropriate. The second, I'd like to ask maybe a follow-up question to AAG Davenport. I assume that because this is an adjudicatory hearing, that it is equally true that there should be no text communications from members of the public during the hearing directed towards commissioners. And that if that has occurred or is occurring, and a member of the commission in any way relies on that information as part of their decision, that they would disclose that fact. And I believe I'm accurately stating what the open record rules say. But it's one thing to say you'll disregard them, and I take everybody at their word that they would. But if in fact you receive something that you rely upon, you should, in my understanding of the law, it would be appropriate to disclose that back.
AG Davenport.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Rapport, for the opportunity to clarify. I agree with your statement. The only attempted communications that I'm aware of have been emails, so I'm not aware of any other texts or phone calls or types to communicate after the opportunity for public comment. But that's an accurate statement of how it should be treated if a commissioner did rely upon that information received after the opportunity for public comment, that they should put that on the record, and certainly the communication itself should be made part of the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and AG Davenport. That's all I wanted to say. When it's appropriate, I do have a short summation, I suppose. And you asked PDC to consider some best management practices overnight, and PDC has done so. And again, maybe it's best that we hear from the commissioners, close that out, but we do have some responses to the request for BMPs.
Well, let's just dive right in then, Mr. Lepore. I was the one who asked for some language around the BMP commitment. Do you want to go ahead and share what you're thinking about?
I think we can do that. I will steer. I may ask some of the panelists for their elaboration on what we have on the screen. But if I think Corey is still the commander of the slide deck. Okay, I guess we'll just take it from the top. And I can see already that there's a couple of changes. But, so number one, we have put in writing that I love Mr. Cochier's term, we will chase technology. Committed to evaluating advancing technology throughout. I think we should say the duration of the cap. Right now, it's 10 years. Any updated BMPs that PDC determines are feasible, that are outside of what was approved within the cap, will be submitted with the site-specific OGDP, if applicable, after a OGDP approval via sundry notice. So that's the attempt to capture the evergreen advanced technologies BMP concept. Next, Mr. Chairman, you asked for signs. We will put signs at the locations with the information so stated up there. I think Commissioner McGowan asked for a commitment to consult with CDPHE. I think that obligation is essentially baked into the rules, but we again will be happy to include it as a BMP. The next are these biannual meetings that PDC has committed to with a variety of stakeholders. So that would be reduced to writing in a BMP in the application. And I have to get my own screen out of my way, sorry. Updates to local governments, updates to the COGCC director, and updates to the community through stakeholder meetings. I think that the Fish and Wildlife consultation is ongoing at the request of CPW. And PDC would like the opportunity to have that Fish and Wildlife Service consultation completed before we commit to different BMPs. We also can put on the table that PDC can drill both locations outside of the nesting season. In other words, in conformance with the timing stipulations. But if and only if one of those rigs runs on diesel. There's just not the power capacity to run 2 electric rigs at the same time. So if the preference of the commission is that we do both of those outside of the STIPs, outside of the timing stipulations, or within the timing stipulations, I guess, the only way to do it is with 1 rig on diesel. We can do that. Otherwise, we are going to ask that we finish the consultation with Fish and Wildlife. And Zach, if I butchered that, please jump in.
No, sir, that was accurate.
So, Mr. Lepore, is that your summary?
No, Mr. Chairman, that was not my summary. That was the best management practices that
Okay,
you have.
actually, I meant your
about.
summary of the proposed BMPs.
Yes, sir, it is.
Okay. So the commission is seeing this for the first time, which is great, and we applaud you for putting it together. I have a comment suggestion as to the BMP language.
Sure.
We're kind of making this up as we go, but I would request that PDC consider a slight change to the language. So in the second sentence, after the word PDC, insert a comma.
I'm sorry, are you on the?
I'm on the top one.
Okay.
PDC is committed to evaluating advancing technology throughout the 10-year comprehensive area plan duration. Any updated best management practices that PDC, and here's my insertion, in consultation with the director, comma, determines are strike feasible, insert reasonable and necessary.
I'm gonna need to.
I understand.
Thank you. I won't even have to finish my sentence.
Take your time. That still leaves it to discretion of the applicant. It adds a consultation provision and it substitutes the word feasible, which is not in the act, with the words that are in the act, reasonable and necessary. So if you could consider that before we get to deliberations, I would appreciate it. And I don't know what my other fellow commissioners think about that. So this is off the cuff, but that would be my one suggestion on that language. I asked for the signs. I'm appreciative of the signs. I'll let the other commissioners weigh in on the stuff they asked for. Commissioner Ackerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. And thank you, Mr. Lepore, for putting forward these BMPs for us to react to. I appreciate that very much. I'm looking at the last 2 BMPs there, and to be honest, I feel like they're kind of far away from the discussion that we had yesterday as far as I'm concerned. I think we had some significant discussion about CPW being okay with the Denali pad if we're able to drill both of those outside. We had separate discussion of the timing stipulations. We had separate discussion about the importance of electrification of rigs. I understand, as Mr. Lepore has pointed out, the operational difficulties associated with trying to get 2 rigs on the ground at the same time and not having the power to do so, making it impossible to do so. That said, one of my issues is that. The other issue is the reliance upon the Fish and Wildlife Service rather than our state expert CPW, who's been the primary consultant on this. I understand there is a Fish and Wildlife Service piece. I don't agree with BMPs that then give that consultory role to Fish and Wildlife Service on this nest rather than CPW in conjunction with Fish and Wildlife Service. And so I believe CPW should be the recommending entity on the BMPs or the practices associated with that well. And, you know, as I was pondering overnight, I understand that, as was pointed out by PDC a number of times, just a portion of that well pad is within the quarter mile or the half-mile buffer, and there's just a small portion that's inside there. And so I'm hoping that the consideration also included bumping that pad, not necessarily moving it to another location. We talked a number of times yesterday about the feasibility of being able to bump things, 400, 500 feet, but not necessarily 6 miles. I would be very interested in knowing if maybe they could bump it out.
Okay, am I the only one that lost Commissioner Ackerman?
No, I lost him too. Let's, everybody put pause. Let me see if we can find Commissioner Ackerman. Oh, there he is.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, am I back down?
Yeah, you're back. You may want to start that thought again, Commissioner Ackerman.
Thank you.
I think you were at bumping out the pad, Commissioner Ackerman, and we heard that.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. So my other thought was potentially bumping that pad. We mentioned that we were just a portion of the pad within that half-mile buffer. Working with the landowner to bump that pad outside of that buffer would certainly create a situation that's a lot smoother on this pad. I just, in full disclosure, think that if we have to go forward and choose between one diesel, one electric, and Fish and Wildlife Service Authority rather than CPW Authority, I don't think that I could grant preliminary approval on this pad location. I think we'd have to talk more about the development of potential alternative on this issue, particularly since we still have an opportunity to work with Greeley on this pad location in January. So those are my thoughts, Mr. Lepore and Mr. Chair, on the Eagle's Nest BMPs.
Thank you, Mr. Ackerman, Commissioner Ackerman. Zach, do you want to give some color here?
Yes, please. Thank you for the comments, Commissioner Ackerman. I would like to point out that during preliminary consultation and further consultation with the CPW, as we dug into the details of the Denali and bypass location further, that the CPW recommended we reach out to Fish and Wildlife Service. PDC did not reach out to them on their own. It was by recommendation of the CPW. And during those consultations, the service made it very clear that once our information was over to them and as they drafted their recommendation, they would be consulting with CPW and they would be working hand in hand in the recommendation that they would then be delivering to PDC for the development of these two locations. I would just like to point that out, that it was not PDC that originally reached out to the service. It was by the recommendation of the CPW.
Thank you. If I may, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Liesenfeld. Appreciate that response. And I understood that from your presentation. And perhaps we need to hear from Mr. Moret. I doubt the intent there was to abdicate all authority to Fish and Wildlife Service, but rather just to simply bring them into the conversation rather than to make them the primary consultative agency. So we may need some clarification from Mr. Moret. If the intent from CPW was to make Fish and Wildlife Service the regulatory and consultative agency on this nest, then my thoughts would be different on that specific BMP, but not necessarily different on the overall concerns I have with the pad.
Thank you for that. And whether or not they were going to be the ultimate regulatory or authority and final say on this matter was not clear during when it was asked that we consult with the service from the CPW.
And I would note for the record, Commissioner Ackerman, that Mr. Moret is now impaneled. If you desire to ask questions or communicate with him, go for it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would. Mr. Moret, were you able to hear the conversation so far?
Yes, except for the last sentence by Mr. Liesenfeld. I think I got most of it, but when I was switching from to panelist, I missed about 5-10 seconds of it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Can you clarify, as per the presentation yesterday, and I believe as per your comments, the thought on we're talking about the Denali nest or the Denali site with the eagle nest nearby between that and the bypass, that it was CPW that initiated a conversation between PDC and Fish and Wildlife Service. And the BMPs that were reflected today essentially move that consultative authority over to Fish and Wildlife Service rather than CPW on this nest. And wanted to know if that was the intent of CPW.
Thank you for the question, Commissioner Ackerman. And no, that was not the intent. As I believe I heard a little bit from Mr. Leisenfeld, that the recommendation should be in concert between Fish and Wildlife and CPW and not solely Fish and Wildlife alone. As I believe I described yesterday, Fish and Wildlife, or maybe I didn't, Fish and Wildlife, they have a larger responsibility for eagles, not just Colorado, but also throughout what's the Central Flyway. So 8 states and then also nationally too. And so they take a different approach to eagle management than Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And so our intent of having PDC to reach out to Fish and Wildlife Service to see if they need to obtain a take permit, that was the main reason, but that wasn't to advocate any of CPW's other BMPs for this eagle nest, which we believe should still be maintained to protect this eagle nest, as I described yesterday, since it is newer on the landscape. So it is more subject to nest failure, since there isn't that site fidelity or the recurring nesting history year after year. Does that answer your question, Commissioner Ackerman?
It does. Thank you, Mr. Moret. I appreciate that. So to Mr. Lepore and the PDC team, I think on the final BMP, it could be reworded to include CPW. PDC will follow CPW and Fish and Wildlife Service recommendations for the development of the bypass location. And I think that would alleviate my concern there, noting that the larger concern of having a diesel power rig and an electric rig be the only option to developing this site still give me pause, significant pause for approval of preliminary siting for this, and would again refer you to my previous comment of the potential of maybe bumping this site a little bit to get it outside of that buffer.
Thank you, Commissioner Ackerman. I think your position is clear for PDC, and we will take it under advisement in whatever time we have left to us.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Having reviewed this, I have one other slight suggested edit that I think is helpful to the cause. So I'll go ahead. It's with regard to the signage. Can we put in some language that the sign is visible from the public road? Somewhere within that. And I would note that AAG Davenport has this document and is redlining it to accommodate the suggested edits. And we will share that with you, Mr. Lepore, and your clients, and give you sufficient time to be able to sort of determine whether the edits are acceptable or not. But that would be, I think, my last edit. And now would recognize Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And in that vein, I'm wondering if we could make the sign a little bigger. I just don't think a 2x2 sign is very visible and something that people are going to see. I'm going to assume that you're also going to put contact information on there. Like if you have questions, give us a call. And so I'm wondering if we can make the sign bigger. And I was trying to look up like how big a sign should be when you're in a jurisdiction of making a planning or a zoning change or changing the purpose of a building, and I couldn't find it. So I don't, but 2x2 is a little small.
Again, Commissioner McGowan, maybe I can just have a standing statement that we hear you and will evaluate those recommendations. I also want to say on the visible from the road, I fully understand the purpose, Mr. Chairman. There are some constraints on private property, on where these signs can be placed. So I'm laying that foundation for maybe Mr. DeRose or others who will have more knowledge than I do about the specifics. But I do know there are constraints about where these things can be placed on people's property and whether or not they will be visible from a public road at that time. But I think that said, we understand and we'll huddle up and maybe, well, leave it there.
Yeah. Okay. So, Commissioner, let's continue with thoughts from commissioners about the BMPs, and then we'll roll into where I thought we were starting, which is, do we have any additional questions? Commissioner Cross has raised his hand.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for putting these together. I just wanted to ask a couple clarifying questions, specifically with the two rigs. So I understand, is running the two rigs the only way you would be able to meet the timing stipulation on the bypass and the Denali within your proposed schedule? Or would you be able to, within the outside of the December through July timeframe, be able to do them consecutively?
Thanks, Commissioner Cross. I think I can answer that. The two rigs was in response to Mr. Moret's comment yesterday, essentially, if we can run them concurrently. And to do that, electrified, we just don't have the capacity on the grid to run two rigs at the same time within that window. So that was kind of the offer, was we can run them concurrently and move two rigs in at the same time. It just one would have to be on diesel, the other would have to be on line power, if we want to do it at the same time. Now, if we were to run them sequentially, there is potential for one at the bypass to start a little into the latter end of the window, and then the Denali could be completely outside of the window. And I think that's what we talked about yesterday, is that we could agree to keep the Denali completely outside of the windows, knowing that there will be a little overlap with the bypass.
Okay. Mr. Moret, I'd be interested to hear your expert opinion on which of those is preferable. If the fledging is done in, say, mid-June, as it was this last year, if starting the bypass in mid-June would be better, so we could continue to do the electrification, or if you still prefer doing the simultaneous drilling.
Thank you for the question, Commissioner Cross. And I would propose an option C that not necessarily concurrently, but consecutive off seasons. So July through November and say 24, and then July to November and 25, or whatever the year is. So that way both off seasons are avoided, since there are two rigs for one eagle nest. That would be my preference, avoidance. Again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I like camping on the avoidance topic as long as possible.
Okay, understood.
Commissioner.
I appreciate that. And then the other clarifying question, and to clarify Commissioner Ackerman's request for consideration, with respect to the bump out, was that something that was considered? My understanding, at least looking at the maps that have been provided, is that the facility would be as far south and the facility is outside the buffer zone, but the wellheads would be to the north of the facility. Can those be moved, or is there operationally, does there need to be a specific distance from the facility for those wellheads?
I guess I'll speak to the wellheads themselves. There needs to be a certain distance between each wellhead, just for operations outside of or in the production time frame where we need to get a workover rig. They can't be, we have 15-foot center to centers between our wellhead, and that's really the minimum we can go between wellheads. Now, the orientation of those wellheads in proximity to the facility, it's not necessarily a distance. It's the orientation on the lands that we have to put those to fit in with the land use of that area.
Yeah, it's essentially, Commissioner Cross, is a convergence of two pivots, both on the west and east sides where they come together. And those the well orientation in north and south are wedged between those pivots, not to hinder his future and current operations with his turf farm. So necessitating a complete movement to the east side of the production facility, which it would be kind of the only option at this point, would completely disable his pivot from moving in a 360-degree manner for his entire crop circle to on the west side.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Cushier, could I ask you maybe if you would elaborate for Mr. Moret's benefit of what happens to the timing if you wait to be able to run the electric rigs on Denali and bypass?
Yeah, because we're not just talking about rigs, then we're talking about the completion crews after. So if we're talking about having to be strictly in that window year after year, then we're looking at essentially a 4-year development potentially, at those 2 locations for drilling on electric rigs, and then subsequently coming in with our hydraulic fracture crews as well. So our goal is really to get in and out of an area as quickly as possible, so that the pre-production activities are over, and then it just goes to steady state production and limited disturbance. So that would potentially greatly extend the duration of which we're in that area.
And Mr. Chair, if I may, I know that it was talked about these sites being drilled first because of Greeley having the greatest amount of development. I know that is coming up in January. Do you know if there are proposed developments nearby for the bypass in the Denali, or was that kind of put first just because that's the most likely to have development first?
Thanks for your question, Commissioner Cross. There's no platted subdivisions in the area of the bypass in Denali at the present state. We're just anticipating that just because of the urban sprawl. So we don't anticipate that happening, within, 2023, 2024, but we're just anticipating as Greeley expands westbound to get those out. But no, there's nothing of record of a platted subdivision around there at this point, but we'll see what the future holds.
And I just want to add, I know there was some consternation around a diesel rig. We can also run a dual fuel rig, which would be, a blend of natural gas and diesel, if we wanted to drill them concurrently.
And then I think my final question, Mr. Chair, this area in the north is one of the areas that has the infrastructure for piping already established, correct?
That is correct. It would just be an extension, really across Highway 34, to bring the infrastructure in. It's directly adjacent to an area that's already on production and has been developed by PDC.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I could talk a little bit about the biannual update. Is that going to be formal or informal to the director? And by the director, do we mean the commission? Sorry, I'm trying to understand what this is going to look like. And then if after we could talk about what that looks like, I'd like to talk about some things that I want to make sure would be included in that biannual report or update.
Commissioner McGowan, my suggestion would be you tell us your preference. If you prefer that this is an update to the commission.
So I would love for it to be an update to the commission, and I'm kind of kicking myself that we didn't think about this for some of the other applications that we've seen. I think it's good for us to stay in touch with you and kind of know where things are in the process, but I don't know where my other fellow commissioners are about that. So I think maybe that's a topic for conversation. But some things I would like to see in that biennial update, and maybe that's why it's important that for me, maybe to hear from you, and it doesn't need to be long, but some things that I would like to see is kind of an update on where PDC is at and trying to reduce emissions during completions, and that chasing technology piece, and whether progress has been made there, whether or not the camel or the moose has been placed at certain sites as you're drilling, and the results from any of those air emissions. And I guess I'll have to ask CDPHE if they're okay, because they would have to provide some information for that, I guess. And then I think any changes to the surrounding area, in particular to RBUs versus this application and what you've presented to the commission. So we know if there's been a change in the status of number of RBUs that are within the 2,000 feet. And then for me, also kind of maybe a summary if you've had any complaints and how those were addressed.
So I have one initial response. Again, I think we're going to have a little bit of time to take all of this under advisement. You know, one of the things I probably wanted to touch on a little bit later is that built into Rule 314 is an update and a report to the commission on what has changed at a location that has preliminary siting approval at the time of the OGDP submittal. So that part's built in there, and sort of the merits of doing this every 6 months, you know, again, we want to probably think about that.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. So if that covers that piece, you can remove that from my request, but I think it's important as part of the discussions we've been having and concerns from commissioners about what happens between now and when you actually do the drilling and completions.
Understood.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the consideration of these BMPs, or the proposal of these BMPs, because I think you're trying to get at some of the discussions that we had yesterday. But I think like my initial thought on this is we're making it more complicated than it needs to be, because each one of these sites is going to be requiring an OGDP and an OGDP review, which, according to Mr. Coffin yesterday, would include consultation with CDPHE, and I think we can put some specificity on what we would like from CDPHE in that consultation. And I would encourage us to include verification of the emissions info that has been provided for the individual OGDP based on what's actually being proposed in the site-specific OGDP, as well as verification of the emissions reductions calculations, because I think that's an important piece. I think there's opportunities in that OGDP review to have additional consultation with CPW site-specific in order to be able to provide OGDP-specific BMPs based on what's occurring there once they actually understand the specifics and the timing of everything, because each OGDP has to be reviewed independent and does not have to be, has the option of not being approved if it's not protective at that stage. I also think that each OGDP, and I would encourage the operator to acknowledge this, but would require all the submittal requirements in 304B. And I would like to also see that include ALAs, specifically on the 7 that the director's recommendation suggested for not having preliminary siting, because that information that's provided in the 304B for the 2A submittals is really the information that hits at what these BMPs are trying to hit, including community engagement plans, alternative location analysis, consultations, and site-specific BMPs associated with those OGDPs. And so that type of information is also necessary for this commission to look at in order to be able to determine whether the ultimate OGDP that would be reviewed by us meets the protective standards that we're required to review all OGDPs for, whether they're in a cap or not within a cap. And so I guess I throw that out there as a consideration for PDC, particularly because that is what the request in the director's recommendation was from staff, was that all the information provided in 304B was to be provided on each OGDP in order to be able to have the information necessary to make a determination on whether or not these specific OGDPs within this cap are protective, and that to give the applicant the ability to choose to have additional considerations made under the review of 604B1, 604B2, and potentially 604B4, although that's not specific review criteria, but the information that would be provided in there should be able to meet the to provide the necessary information in order for us to be able to determine whether these OGDPs are protective or not.
Commissioner Messner, I'd like to respond briefly. I would phrase it this way. I think when you drafted and adopted Rule 314, you put some checks and balances in there. And one of those checks is the one that you just talked about. That is, all of these have to have an OGDP and a Form 2A approval, notwithstanding the cap approval. So at the end of the day, you hold that trump card. But some of the other balancing factors are that we need to know where to build our sites. In order to bring you the world-class BMPs that everybody wants, I believe the commission wants it. I believe the CDPHE wants it.
So, Mr. Lepore, before you go any further there, I don't understand where in 304B it says that you're going to adjust sites. It's talking about submittal requirements in order to be able to provide the information necessary for both the staff and the commission to be able to determine whether or not these sites are protective or not, and whether to be able to make a decision whether to approve them or not. It's not a determination of where the location is going to be, but specifically what you're proposing at this site within the 2A, including a rationalization that you've already done within the cap, but then it boils it down more specifically to the OGDP within the alternative location analysis that makes a showing of why this is the best location.
So I guess when you say 304B, I read it to include 304B2, which is an alternative location analysis.
Correct. So you're taking an alternative location analysis on a specific site, which you've already done within the cap, and you're using it as a showing to show that this is the appropriate site, and that you're showing the appropriate BMPs within that OGDP that build upon that site in order to determine, to make your burden of proof that this particular OGDP is protective with the BMPs, site-specific BMPs that you propose. Included in that, because there is an ALA inclusion, it would be your community outreach plan that shows that level of community engagement and outreach with the community that you're committing to in the proposed BMPs that you're suggesting here. But then that would actually formalize it within the OGDP plan, would also create, because if you look at your calendar, you're sequentially moving through these 22 sites over the next 10 years, which is about 2-ish a year, which is the same biannual or twice a year check-ins that you're indicating that you're going to do in this BMP, only you're doing it on an OGDP by OGDP level so that it's more relevant to the particular areas and locations that you're working in at the time.
So I'm not seeking to quibble with you, Commissioner Messner. I'm simply saying that there's another rule under 314 B5B that says if an operator receives preliminary siting approval, the operator need not submit an ALA pursuant to Rule 304B2. What does that rule mean to you?
Well, what I'm trying to do is create an opportunity here, because right now you've got a director's recommendation that is indicating that they do not recommend preliminary siting on 7 of these sites. And the reason is because they feel like they need an ALA and they need all the information that's incorporated in 304B. Up until this point, I'm generally not inclined to go against a staff recommendation on anything that has come in front of us. And so I'm trying to say there may be an opportunity here for you to provide that information on an OGDP level and still potentially get preliminary siting. But you would have to propose that as a BMP, because there is that rule in there that essentially would give you the ability to not have to do an ALA. But in lieu of that, it's going to be hard for me to look at going against staff's recommendation for preliminaries, not providing preliminary siting on 7 sites because of some concerns they have around, well, that was indicated in the director's recommendation, and I'm happy to read that during our deliberations.
So I would like to ask you, for my benefit, I heard you say we start with the ALA that's already been done. When we come before you for a particular OGDP, we say, here's the ALA from before. And then tell me what more, I understand there's a separate list of informational requirements under 304, but tell me where we go from, here's the ALA that we previously did.
Well, I mean, throughout this process, you guys have talked about the evergreen nature of this and the different technologies that may occur in the next 5 years and the different things that may happen on the ground, or the different, whatever that may be. You've got an ALA that you started with within the cap, but now you've got 6 years later, 7 years later, you're working on this particular site, and there's a technology, or there's a an infrastructure development, or there's 55 bald eagles nests that have come and roosted 100 yards from the site, or whatever that may be. You're able to modify and adjust that ALA for conditions that you see on the ground at the time that you submit the OGDP, in order to be able to incorporate whatever the specific BMPs are for that site, and that may ultimately impact your decision as far as where to place that site, should you feel like you're not going to be able to do it protective, but more than likely you're still going to be able to have that site, and you're just going to be specific about the BMPs that you're providing, because you've already done a clear alternative location analysis within the cap. Does that make sense?
And Commissioner Mesner, if you will, PDC will commit to update the ALAs at the time of the OGDP submittals. If the culturals have changed, distances between receptors, our BMPs have changed, we will commit to do that.
Great. I appreciate that, Mr. Coshier. I think that would be really helpful.
I'd like to weigh in on this point, and I think we're moving into kind of deliberations versus Q&A, but I went back last night and looked at the SBP around this point, Mr. Coshier and Mr. Lepore, and I think that the rule contemplates just that. And let me read something into the record so that we're all on the same page and we're all playing with the same set of dominoes. The commission intends for preliminary siting approval to incentivize operators to submit applications by reducing potentially duplicative filings for the commission if an operator is able to identify appropriate oil and gas locations as part of the CAP application. However, preliminary siting approval pursuant to Rule 314 does not guarantee that the commissioner director will ultimately approve or recommend approval of associated Form 2As within the CAP. The commission and director will review those future Form 2As on a case-by-case basis, taking into account potential changes in land use between the date the CAP was approved and the date the Form 2A was approved, as well as BMPs and conditions of approval that may be necessary and reasonable to protect public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. When an operator submits a Form 2A for a location within a CAP that has preliminary siting approval, the operator must identify any land use changes that have occurred, including both planned and actual land uses between the CAP application was submitted and the subsequent Form 2A is submitted. However, when an operator has received preliminary siting approval, the rules 304B2A Roman numeral 2 and 307B3 provide the commissioner director may require an alternate location analysis for Form 2A when necessary to evaluate a proposed oil and gas location. So I mean, I think that when we flesh out what preliminary siting approval means, we're getting to the result that Commissioner Messner was looking for and the result that you've just committed to, Mr. Coshier. So I appreciate the discussion and the dialogue. I just wanted everyone to know what we inserted into the SBP that fleshed out and frames out what preliminary siting is, what it's not, and how we're going to deal with it down the road when the OGDP comes into play. Hopefully that was helpful.
Mr. Chairman, I thought it was helpful, and I'd like to ask a follow-up clarifying question. Are we, maybe this is for Commissioner Messner, are we talking about the 304B2 information on the 7 locations that staff flagged in their in the director's recommendation?
Thank you, Mr. Lepore. I mean, 304B2 information is going to be required for every site because it's a Form 2A, and Form 2As are required for every site. I would say that the additional incorporation of the ALA as appropriate, depending on whether or not there are sites that include receptors within 2,000 feet, if they're RBUs, or if they're in disproportionately impacted communities, or if there's high priority habitat incorporated, should also include an ALA update as part of that submittal requirement. There are sites that you've included in this cap that don't have any of those, and so they would require some information that's provided in 304B, but may not require that ALA submittal or that ALA update when that OGDP is submitted.
Thank you.
Okay.
Mr.
Go
Chair,
ahead, Mr. Coshier.
I just wanted to follow up on a question from Commissioner McGowan yesterday that we weren't able to answer. And if it's all right, I'm the chair of my screen.
Go ahead.
Okay, so Commissioner McGowan, you asked about the essentially the RBUs being pulled in to the potential wells to be reclaimed or plugged and reclaimed due to this development. And there's a couple caveats to this map. Let me see if I can put it. Okay. One being that these 2,000-foot setbacks are around the surface hole locations of each of these wells. So we're not talking about disturbance area. We're not talking about facilities. And I apologize, this is what we could do overnight. So, and then also the second caveat is these are address points within Weld County, so not necessarily strictly RBUs. There are RBUs incorporated into that. But really, I think the visual is the most impactful that we're talking about. If you look at pink, the area of pink is everything within 2,000 feet of that wellhead only. And like I said, not the disturbance area, not the facility. So, we just want to kind of help quantify and show the picture of really the reduction of impacts. And these yellow dots are the RBU, the address points being pulled in by those setbacks.
Follow up, Commissioner McGowan.
No, and I thank you so much for putting this together last night. I think that, as we're contemplating cumulative impacts and thinking about people being close to something that could be emitting, right? And this was done before 181 and the 2,000-foot setback and community engagement. I think it's important for us to understand kind of the trade-offs here and what's happening as part of this proposal. And I think this visual is helpful. And I appreciate you all putting that together last night. you know, thank you. It's
Yep.
helpful.
Yeah, because I think it helps tie the story of, not just the proximity, but then to your point about the emissions, replacing all these wells with, highest of technology facilities and reducing the emissions in the area. And sometimes a lot of these wells are really in close proximity to existing address points.
Okay, are
Sorry.
there? Go ahead,
So
Commissioner
just
Gilman.
if I'm understanding correctly, what we potentially could be doing is, yes, there are 147, sorry, I think that's the number of RBUs in this proposal, this application that would be within 2,000 feet, but we're potentially eliminating 3,000 plus RBUs that are currently within 2,000 feet of existing infrastructure.
Yep,
Am I
that's
understanding what you're saying?
that's completely accurate. It'd be a delta of around 3,000.
Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Cushier. At this point, does commissioners have further questions for the panel? Commissioner Cross.
I just want to bring up a couple follow-up questions about that. And as Commissioner McGowan said, thank you very much for putting that together. That's very helpful and I think illustrative of what we're trying to do here. My first question is the 3,200, to clarify for the record, that's for the 287 PDC wells that would be plugged and abandoned, or is that for also the 289 that you're talking about?
Yeah, that's the cumulative of the subset of wells from PDC and other operators that we are assuming are going away due to this. From a land use standpoint, the emissions reductions that we showed yesterday is strictly for PDC's own wells. And the reason for that is because, those emissions are reported, so we can't, contemplate the reductions of other operators' emissions that are reported on their COEI.
Okay. And with respect to what you said yesterday about that, Mr. Cushier, you said that although the 289 you can't guarantee would be plugged and abandoned because they're for other operators, these are operators that you work with in the CAP area that you have some overlapping interests with. So it's likely they will be plugged and abandoned, correct?
Yeah, like I said, the vast majority of those 289 are for one operator that we work interchangeably with through development and really that's from past acquisitions of acreage that we work hand in hand as we move through and develop new horizontals, working with that other operator on the offsets that are going away and timing of our hydraulic fracturing operations.
Okay, thank you. And then my one other clarifying point, you said there'd be a delta of about 3,000 there. The 149, 147, whatever it is, the RBUs within 2,000 feet under the proposed cap. How many of those 147, 149, whatever it is, already are within 2,000 feet of some of those existing legacy wells?
So I don't have that number for you, but if we look at the 149, that is within 2,000 feet of our disturbance. So even though we're only pulling address points for the 3206, that's from the 2,000 feet from the wellhead. So I think it's conservative in that's a pretty accurate. Now looking at the map and the shading of pink, it covers a lot of the area of the cap. So like I said, I don't have an exact number of the RBUs within our proposed locations that are still within that pink, but I would have to say based on the visual of the map, there is quite a few.
Okay. And sorry.
And just to clarify, sorry, Commissioner Cross, it is 149.
Okay. And sorry to throw that question on you. I realize you already put together a lot of work last night to try and prepare that, but I thought that might be helpful for illustrative purposes as well. Thank you.
Other final questions, clarifications from commissioners to the panel? Okay, I think we've exhausted our questioning. At this point, I would like to call upon Mr. Lepore for whatever closing he wanted to put together. Is that fair, Mr. Lepore?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I'll be very brief. I think the last bit of conversation has flushed out a lot of these issues, and I appreciate that. I do want to say that first, I have to give credit to Brian Kochier for this phrase. He called this everyone's application. And I think that is a very accurate description. PDC has engaged with everyone to bring this forward to you and done so over a very long period of time with a great deal of flexibility and a great deal of commitment to reducing all of the impacts possible by siting and by its BMPs and by its willingness to build out this infrastructure. One of the most important aspects of this for them is the preliminary siting. Your rules contemplated at least a 6-year cap plan where preliminary siting was an option that would allow an operator like PDC to build out this infrastructure and bring forward those best management practices. To me, they are putting all of their chips in, and they are leaving a lot hanging on getting preliminary siting approval so that they know where to build that infrastructure out to. As Commissioner Messner has pointed out, and as Chairman Robbins read from the Statement of Basis and Purpose, which we've all read too, at the end of the day, you could say, we're not going to approve a given OGDP. We would certainly hope that changing a location is the option of last resort, that you understand what is going into a preliminary siting decision and approval and allowing them to go forward. And that only in the most extreme circumstances where no set of BMPs could be deemed protected, are we having the conversation about moving the location. That's what we need here. Preliminary siting has to mean something. You put it in the rules as an incentive. We understand. We're going to give you all kinds of updated information. PDC has agreed from the beginning to update their information, to update their BMPs, to comply with the rules as you wrote them about what they need to do when they bring those OGDPs forward. None of that is an issue. All of that is, they've gone beyond. We just need to understand that changing those locations has got to be the option of last resort. Appreciate all of your attention and time and the questions and the thoughtfulness.
Okay, what I'd like to do at this point is ask AG Davenport to share his screen. He has the redlined document. He copied y'all's document and now he's made some red lines to it. Or if you could share your screen, Kyle, and then hold on, let's let that happen first before I go into my next thought.
Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to. I have, just for everyone's edification, taken some notes that may in the course of the discussion have become irrelevant or require change. Just for my own purposes, Mr. Chair, should I delete those and just keep what I think are the changes? What's your
Yeah, maybe
preference on that?
make a copy of it so that you've got it and just share what has the changes. Where I'm going with this to my fellow commissioners and to the applicant is I want to share the screen. I want to give the applicant 10-15 minutes to consider the changes. I want the applicant to come back and let us know what the applicant's thoughts are about the edits. And then I'm going to move the commission into deliberation. Is that fair? Okay.
Okay, one moment, please, then.
Can I ask if Mr. Davenport could email a copy of that too? So we have it in hard copy.
Sure.
Yes, I'm happy to.
Thank you.
Okay.
Chair, if you will, just a procedural question. The slide I just brought up on the screen, do I need to send that over as well as part of the record?
Yeah, send that over to Hearings Manager Larson.
Okay, thank you. sir.
That's new information, right?
Yeah, that wasn't part of our slide deck previous, but I just wanted to make sure procedurally we're checking the boxes.
You're sounding like a lawyer, Mr. Koshier.
I spent enough time with him, so it's rubbing off.
Sorry to hear that.
Okay. Mr. Chair, I am going to share my screen now. And am sharing the document that I did just email to Mr. Lepore. Is that large enough for everyone to see? Mr. Lepore, you're muted if you're trying to.
I'm laughing at myself because I'm getting so close to the screen to try to read it.
Yeah, if you could get it a little bit larger, Mr. Davenport.
Looks like your screen is not full, Agent Davenport.
My screen is not what? I'm sorry.
It looks like your screen is not expanded. Is it the full?
So I've never done this before. I have a vertically oriented monitor that I may have to move to a different screen. I'm going to stop share just in case to avoid inadvertently sharing something.
I have a vertically oriented screen and it does not work well for this purpose.
Okay, appreciate that. Give me one moment. Okay. I think I'm ready to do this now. How is that?
There you go. Now you need to shrink it a little bit.
Okay. Oops. I may not be able to get everything on one screen for you and still keep it large enough to read.
Why don't we all look at this first part just to make sure we're on the same page?
I'll scroll down just a little bit to try to capture a little more. Oops.
Okay, go ahead and scroll down.
Do you want us to give approvals as we go that we're fine with the language? Because the first one.
What I was going to do is have you huddle outside of the hearing with your lawyer and then give you a chance to come back in 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, I mean, if procedurally, I think we can march through. I mean, the first one with the technology, we are fine with. The ALA, we are fine with.
Okay, Mr. Laporte, do you want to take the email document, spend 10 minutes with your client, and then we'll come back and say 10 minutes, and then we'll start deliberation?
I'd really like 15 minutes, Mr. Chairman, but
that's fine. Let's come back at 9:30.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
And Mr. Davenport, if you could email that document to the 5 commissioners as well.
Yeah, we'll do.
Okay. All right. We'll see everybody at 9:30. Okay, we are back on the record on the Guanella cap application. We have all received the proposed BMPs and the red lines. The first thing I would like to do is acknowledge PDC's attorneys for some feedback with regard to the red line BMP that was shown on the screen as well as emailed to you. Mr. Pashala?
Yes, Chair Robbins, we need about another 5, at most 10 minutes, but I think 5 minutes just to finalize our revisions and we'll be back on the presentation.
Okay. Just visualize yourself when you're ready and work quickly.
Very good. We're almost there.
Okay. So commissioners, you can go back to your regularly scheduled programming. Once we see Mr. Pashala, we know to visualize yourselves. Okay, we are back on the record. See, everybody's visualized themselves. Would first call upon PDC's folks. Mr. Laporte, looks like you're unmuted. Did you want to speak to the redlined edits at this time?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will share a screen if I'm capable of doing so.
As long as it's a horizontal screen.
I have a 1 in 3 chance of getting this right, so. I should be sharing my screen now.
Yes.
Okay. Let me see if I can make you guys all bigger. I guess I can't. Okay. I think the best way to do it is walk through it.
Go for it.
The first one, in consultation with the COGCC director, is fine. So all of that is acceptable to us. The second one, PDC will agree to post a sign of not less than, we put in 3 foot by 3 foot. The contact information, all of that is fine with us. The third one, there were no edits. The fourth one, maybe we should leave till last.
Okay,
No, let's not. Let's just do it. We are essentially amenable to what Mr. Davenport's language was on the 7 locations that the director's recommendation did not recommend preliminary siting approval for. And we would like the clarification, as we understood the language from Commissioner Messner and others, that the ALA reviews are intended to review BMPs and other informational requirements associated with each of those 7 locations. Mr. Chair, I will say that I think your rules are clear, that your rules give you the latitude that Commissioner Messner pointed to, and that we should adhere to the rules as they're written with this BMP for the 7 locations in this circumstance. Biannual meetings with all stakeholders, no edits there. As far as the biannual updates to the commission, we would be amenable to written biannual updates to all local governments and the commission. And there's some additional language there about CDPHE. The main reason CAMEL is there are other equipment monitoring, emissions monitoring equipment that CDPHE might deploy, so we didn't want to be specific to CAMEL. They are in control of the sampling results that they generate, so we don't, PDC would not have access to those in a way to provide them to you. You would obviously be able to get those from CDPHE. So I think those were the only changes really to that one. The written as opposed to in person, I hope is self-explanatory. We cannot agree to move the surface facilities for the Denali location. The ALA speaks to that. And the last one we're fine with. And I can email this back to AAG Davenport, or you tell me where you want to go.
Yeah, I think it might be best if you emailed it back to AAG Davenport. And then he can forward it to each of the commissioners' inboxes and we can all have our own copies of it.
Okay.
And with that, I at least as one commissioner I'm not interested in, sort of double debating this. I think you've heard from us, we've heard from you. This is where the record is, and I think we should move forward in closing the record and moving into deliberations. That's my suggestion to my fellow commissioners. Are you comfortable with that?
Are you asking me, Mr. Chairman?
No, I'm asking my fellow commissioners. Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess a point of clarification. I'm assuming if we close the record that we're not able to hear from staff, because one of the things that would be of interest to me is to get staff's thoughts on PDC's proposed BMPs.
Rather than answer that question, Director Murphy just visualized herself. Director Murphy, you've been monitoring all this. I'm sure you've now seen where we are at with regard to discussions with PDC. Would you like to weigh in from staff's perspective?
Yes, Chair, thank you for the opportunity. And I may pull Sabrina in at some point as well. I think that one of the pieces that I wanted to kind of check in on with commissioners generally is staff's perspective in the director's recommendation. We're really trying to walk a pretty fine line, right? If we compare staff's recommendation from the Crestone cap, in which staff actually recommended denial, and that was really focused on the idea of consolidation, which necessarily required movement, a different latitude, longitude of a particular location in those preliminary siting requests. In contrast, here we have locations that likely are the best locations based on a review of the ALA and the relevant information. But the information that comes at the cap level is not as detailed as what comes in at the OGDP level. And so that's why staff didn't outright recommend denial for preliminary siting for those 7 locations, and instead focused on saying, we think these are probably the best locations, but there is more information we would need before we could sign off on it as a location. And so I think that that's an important distinction. And I think Commissioner Messner's language and some version of the BMPs that are being discussed right now go a long way to help clarify what that expectation is and help address the gap in information, in my mind, between what comes in at an OGDP level versus what comes in at a cap level. And so I think that that's kind of one big picture comment I wanted to make. I think one of the other flags that I've gotten from our folks is it's important to have the OGDP submitted as close in time to the commencement of operations as reasonable, so that we're looking at what actually is going on the ground and have a clear expectation of what is technologically feasible as well as it relates to BMPs. So that is one piece that I wanted to flag. And then if for OGDPs that are submitted sooner rather than later, an updated ALA may not be that necessary. In that things may not have changed. And as I think staff's director's recommendation noted, the ALA provided by PDC was thorough, was detailed, and provided a great deal of information and the right information to be able to evaluate those locations. So if there, and again, we're using times like closer in time, further in time, longer or shorter, which are a little bit, which are not as precise as, 365 days, for example. But it's really, we do have a lot of really good information in the existing ALA. If we get 5 years out, that could change pretty dramatically. And so that's kind of the tension that we're struggling with whether an updated ALA should be required and under what circumstances. And then staff would ask that prior to the commencement of operations, PDC submit a sundry to update any cultural distances or wildlife information. Again, if there's kind of that long gap between, if there's a long gap between today and submittal of the OGDP, just to account for changes on the ground.
Director Murphy, can I follow up with a question or two?
Yeah.
So the first point you made about clarifying that it wasn't a firm sort of denial rec and that the locations are likely the best. I don't think we have questions, or I don't have questions on that. the second one, to have OGDPs submitted as close as possible to actual work. If that's not captured in a COA or a BMP, I think under the terms of Rule 314, they could file for all their locations next week and then not plan on actually, operating them until year 9. Is that something that you would recommend we try to address and it doesn't have to be a firm deadline or something, and we can use close language, et cetera. It's just getting a commitment from the applicant that's what you want, that's what we want, that's what they want.
I think it would be helpful in, recognizing we're supposed to jump topics in 10 minutes. Maybe it's something that we could have staff and PDC talk about briefly. I mean, unless we get to a motion and decision in record time.
We're not going to get to a motion and decision in 9.5 minutes.
Yeah.
So why don't we do that? Mr. Lepore, you will be directed to work with staff on that concept when we jump topics to the 10 a.m. cumulative impacts report. And then the final piece, Director Murphy, prior to commencement of operation sundry for receptor changes. Is that something you feel comfortable that you have within your rules now? Or is that something you should work on as well with, during the jump topics part?
I think it's worth exploring between staff and PDC and kind of seeing what comes out of it.
Okay, so at least from this commissioner, that's direction on 2 topics for staff and the applicant to have some discussions while we are entertaining our other topic at 10. I'm looking around at fellow commissioners. If anyone has questions for the director, given what we just heard. Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you guys are talking through this over the next, well, I don't want to say break, but as staff and PDC are discussing this too, the language that's proposed by PDC following at the end of that paragraph that indicates that ALA reviews are intended to review BMPs and other informational requirements associated with each of the proposed 7 locations. To me, that ALA is not limited to that. It's limited to the ALA review that's incorporated in our rules. And so I wouldn't necessarily want to see it limited to just that. I understand the concerns about moving sites, and that's not my intent, but I do think that there's a broader discussion within an ALA that may be provided 6-7 years from today that may need to be incorporated in decision making, and so would not want to limit that analysis. So, but I will leave it to staff and PDC to discuss the specifics on that.
Thank you, Commissioner. Chair, if I may, Mr. Lepore, could you send the document to me and Sabrina Trask and Doug Andrews?
Of course.
Okay, let's allow that to happen. It's 9:54. We're supposed to convene at 10 for the cumulative impacts report. Mr. Lepore, are you and your group comfortable at least with the direction from the commission that you are to sort of undertake some additional discussions?
I believe so, Mr. Chairman, with staff during this next break, and I guess we'll do that. Maybe, I don't know, Director Murphy, do you want to send an invitation, or who are we engaging with?
I may be otherwise occupied, so I've asked Sabrina to coordinate with you directly, and trust that you'll be able to get the right folks from PDC there.
Okay.
Okay, so Director Murphy, while I have you, you are actually the topic of the 10 a.m. Do you have a sense of timing on that?
I would suggest that in classic Director Murphy fashion, my presentation is very brief. And from there, we may have, I would suspect, some dialogue amongst the commissioners about where we're going, what we've seen, and having a conversation about what the current status of the cumulative impacts report data gathering looks like, and what we may want the following or future processes to look like. So I would say somewhere between 20 and 45 minutes.
Okay, so knowing that we have a little bit of a hard stop at around noon, why don't we plan on reconvening this agenda item at 10:45 via this link that everyone is on? For those of you in the audience and stakeholders, you can just hit mute and pause and just wait for us to get back. But we'll plan on coming back to this docket at 10:45. Do I have hearings manager Larson or Miss Amaro? I guess procedurally, I'm trying to figure out how are we to gather for the CI meeting? Is that a different Zoom?
No, Chair, I think we can just stay on. It's part of our regular agenda. Sorry for jumping over the hearings team, but
Okay.
As soon as Mr. Lepore stops sharing, I can share a presentation and get launched in, or we can take 4 minutes and regroup, whatever.
And so do you want all of us to log out? Or just mute and?
I think,
Hi.
Mr. Lepore, I think you can just mute and unvisualize and plan on coming back at 10:45.
And use a different media platform to talk to your staff. Got it.
Okay, so for those that are listening in, we have halted for the time being the Guanella cap permit, and we are going to the agenda item on our regularly scheduled agenda, that is the cumulative impacts report. So with that, would ask the remaining Ms. Knopf, if you want to unvisualize, there you go. Okay, so now we've got the commissioners and Director Murphy. And Director Murphy, you are recognized for this agenda matter.
Great. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, commissioners. Let me pull up a presentation, and then I'm going to take just maybe 15 seconds to organize myself. Okay. I've got a lot going on my screens, so if somebody has a question, please feel free to interrupt me. As the chair noted, this is staff update on the cumulative impacts report. It's December 8th, and I'm the director, Julie Murphy of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. What I would like to do first is start with a reminder about our first report. Context for COGCC's cumulative impacts report is that in November of 2020, the Commission adopted Rule 904, which required an annual cumulative impacts report from the staff to the Commission. The first report was published on January 18th, which was the first working day after the deadline of January 15th. That report focused on a review of data collected through 2021, which was inherently limited as the entire suite of mission change rules went into effect in January 2021, changing the way the Commission implements and gathers data. The report also committed to subsequent reports to be published annually by the end of February for the previous calendar year. In working through the first report, staff was very aware of how rough it was to try to spend 14 days, the first 14 days of the year, trying to put together data that was collected over the prior 12 months. So we suggested a little bit longer lead time between the close of the calendar year and being able to provide the report to the commissioners. The report acknowledged the significant work staff had put into the report. We'd work closely with CDPHE as well as CPW staff to provide that information. And of course, it included a robust thank you to APCD and CDPW. I think it really set a solid foundation for what the rules require and provided an opportunity for this commission to start exploring what other information or would be helpful. Again, I think the one thing that is really imperative to keep in mind in the context of cumulative impacts for COGCC is during the rulemaking, there was a robust discussion that to be able to understand cumulative impacts, you need to start with a baseline. And to date, COGCC had not collected a baseline set of information, and that's really what 904 was geared to do, is to start to collect that information that can help inform us of trends or trajectories, or perhaps the slope, if you will, for those of you who love calculus, of how things are going. So there's lots of room to grow is also an important key component to keep in mind. So that, again, that's a recap of the first report. That report is available on our website. So turning now to 2022 and what we expect the report to show in February, there are more OGDP approvals. I know that's not a newsflash to any of you or to any of the folks who are listening in to our hearings over the past year, but in 2021, there were 7 OGDPs approved. I think we have 38 or maybe 42 OGDPs approved so far in 2022. With that comes more data. And that's an important component, again, as we're trying to establish this baseline and try to understand what it is we know and what we don't know. One of the most important pieces is getting that data in. So for example, there was only 1 data point in 2021 on the West Slope. We have more data points now on the West Slope. We didn't have any compensatory mitigation OGDPs in 2021. We do have compensatory mitigation OGDPs in 2022. So again, we're trying to build out that data set to understand how things are growing or how things are changing. I think this last bullet point on this slide, the comparisons of OGDP estimates to actual values, is going to continue to be one of the most interesting aspects of the data collection conducted by CDPHE and also COGCC, right? Our OGDPs collect estimates of emissions, and those actual emissions actually are reported back to APCD, and that's part of some of the data work that Ms. Bartlett is leading to start to understand what that data can and should mean as we move forward. So again, we're trying to build out a data set that provides reviewing in a year-over-year way to identify different trends to inform the commission about how its rules are or are not working. So now I think I want to spend a little bit of time talking more about the estimates and actuals. So for example, we can talk about water used in completions. The Form 5 brings in a lot of that information, and we can start to look at, once we put OGDP approvals on the timeline. So if we had an August 2021 OGDP approved, drilling began, construction and drilling sometime that fall, moving into January 2022, we would start to see the completions work performed, the Form 5s come in, the Form 5A comes in, and that actually provides the data that is the actual water use, for example. So I want to use this as an example to show what data we're going to be able to see, and that something that we couldn't see in 2021 will start to become more apparent in probably in the 2023 report, more so than even 2022. There's just a timing component of this that's really important. But we're on the cusp of getting that information in. Again, kind of the same concept for air quality emissions. The regulatory approval process may have occurred in 2021, but we won't actually see the actual air emissions submitted per APCD or Air Quality Control Commission and the Air Quality Air Pollution Control Division through their process until sometime in 2023 or 2024, which we can then use to, again, compare back to the estimates. We can also compare across other operations that have occurred in that time space. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the lag between our approval process and when we're actually going to see actual data from those approvals. I'm going to totally switch topics now and talk a little bit about the public input I think it's an important component that the rules built out and that this commission has continued to encourage is input about a couple of different areas, evolving technologies and measures, and academic or government reports. We also stood up a website to make sure that we had an opportunity for people to submit information to us about cumulative impacts. I think it's really important to make sure that this is, known throughout the public. It's a great tool for us to be able to survey what other conversations are going on. I know that as we're receiving public comments, we're looking about building that information also into the cumulative impacts conversation as appropriate, given the focus on academic or governmental papers and evolving technologies. That's part of the ongoing conversation before this commission with the different OGDPs. Staff, for anything submitted around evolving technologies or academic or governmental reports, staff will be reviewing for relevancy. I think it's important to note that if somebody wants something considered for the next cumulative impacts report, it needs to be submitted no later than December 31st. That gives us time to take a look at it again and get it into the report as appropriate. I think the place that I really want to close out is Rule 904 specifically contemplates that the commission can request at any time the inclusion of additional data or information into the cumulative impacts report. I have viewed that as something that is a collective decision of the commission and with the advice of the director, right? It's important to understand the limitations of COGCC's data or resources so that when we're talking about gathering more information, it needs to be feasible to gather it, for example, or we need to have enough warning to be able to gather it. So a couple of the things that we suggested in 2021 was really focusing on the SPUD versus plugged-in activity or plug and abandonment activity to be able to understand kind of how that trend is, how the trends are going in the state. So this would include all activity across the state, not just the activity associated or proposed to be part of an OGDP at some point in the future. It would reflect the actual numbers and submittals. And so as we look at this from 2021 to 2022, we're looking at a net decrease, for example, in the DJ Basin, I think specifically, or actually, yeah. So I think that, this is something that staff had suggested to include. I'm not sure that we got clear direction from the commission to include it when we talked about this in May. I think we're in a position to include it subject to your direction today. And I think that, to close out our conversation as a kind of counterpoint, I think that this is the data on the slide is a kind of data that we can provide easily. It's accessible. It's something that we can pull in. It's really helpful, I think, for all of us to understand what oil and gas activity looks like in Colorado on a well-by-well basis. In contrast to that, Commissioner Gonzalez had asked specifically during the May hearing whether we could gather information and break it out by type of well, i.e. oil well or gas well or helium, or by well type, either horizontal, directional, and vertical. And that type of information is, I think, could be important, could be impactful, could be powerful. The challenge is that it's not something that we categorically gather in our database. So it's not data that we can automate, meaning it's a manual review of everything, of all the inputs to evaluate what bucket it fits into. And I think that it is possible that maybe is a worthwhile exercise, but it would be time intensive at this point in time. And that opens the door to kind of the second note of 904 and cumulative impacts data. There's lots of data to gather. One of the questions is can we start gathering it? And so are there conversations that we should be having about adjustments to the Form 2B, for example, to start to gather that now? So again, we start to build that baseline on a go forward basis. So there are lots of different components of today's conversation. I think today I would ask for clear guidance on including the SPUD versus plugged-in activity or plugged-in abandonment activity in the report that would be due out in February of 23, and then welcome a conversation about other changes, other questions, other conversations that we should be having in this space of how do we continue to implement 904 as it's drafted today. There is a lot of latitude for the commission to look at other opportunities. I think, again, we have a good baseline started. We have an opportunity to bring in additional information or additional considerations. That said, I think that the report that we started last year is a fantastic start on understanding where we are and to begin to build the baseline to understand where we're going. So, as I said, Chair, as per usual, unbelievably brief for a very deep, pithy topic. But with that, I wanted to take today to update us about where we were, why we're here, where we were, the conversations we've had over the last 10 months to set us up for a successful presentation of staff's cumulative impacts report per Rule 904 in February of 23, and make sure that, you know, we all understand how we are currently implementing 904 and also flag the important piece of the opportunity to submit additional information to the commission. We need that before December, and then we just need final guidance from commissioners about the scope of the report. So with that, happy to take questions.
Mr. Chair, you were muted.
Great, thank you for the report. Who has questions? Commissioner Messmer?
I'll defer to Commissioner McGowan first, so I'll go after her.
Commissioner McGowan?
Are you sure you want to do that? Because I submitted 15 questions to staff.
I know, so that's why you should go first.
Agreed.
Okay. So to me, this discussion becomes a little more complicated than it was before because of the WEG request for hearing or whatever, which I think intersects a lot with some conversations we've been having as commissioners ever since the beginning of us trying to figure out what it means to look at cumulative impacts. And so, I mean, one of the things we're going to have to deal with, I think, as commissioners is what is the purpose of the cumulative impacts report, and understanding that it can't be all things to all folks. I'm not sure that we've actually had a really good discussion of what its purpose is and how the commission is going to use it over time. And so that cannot be addressed today, but I think it's something that we as commissioners at some point need to really kind of button up so that our stakeholders maybe can understand what the report's purpose is and how we're using it. And again, not trying to get ahead of myself, but a lot of folks who submitted comments to the WEG proposal have a lot of ideas, a lot of suggestions, and it can quickly feel overwhelming from a resource and expertise perspective. So I guess that I think I'm going to put on the table for some future discussion. I've been thinking about the data that we've been collecting that populates CIDR and maybe some things that we don't have in the cumulative impacts report or that might be missing. I think NOx is something that we don't have parsed out, and it is an important component for non-attainment. And what we're looking at from a cumulative impacts perspective, I think that's already from discussion with staff. I think this is already collected in the Form 2B and therefore potentially in CIDR. And so I think all we have to do, I think, is pull the data and now have it and add it to the cumulative impacts report. So that's one recommendation I might make to a change in the CI report. To Director Murphy's point, it's important for folks to understand the emissions estimates that we're collecting, then compared to actuals with CDPHE are lagging behind. But I did have in here that I'm still interested in making sure that where there's a comparison to emissions estimates with the actuals that get submitted over at CDPHE. And I think there's a gap there still, but hopefully that's going to start populating as CDPHE collects information. I am interested I think the next really important conversation for the commission from a cumulative impacts perspective is also water use and where that water ends up and whether or not it's getting reused. And I think eventually that will get tied to what Commissioner Mesner is doing with his produced water work group. I don't know if I'm calling that right, but I think that's what it's called. And I would be interested in better information collection, not just on the front end of how much of an operator thinks they're going to use, but how much actually gets used, how much at the beginning is recycled water, and how much at the end ends up being recycled, and hopefully for future purposes of drilling or completions, because it's a lot of water that we're talking about. And I realize that in an individual OGDP assessment, maybe in comparison to other water uses, it doesn't feel like a lot. But when you start adding it all up, this is a lot of water that we're talking about. And I think this is the next piece that operators could really take to the challenges, especially in the DJ Basin. That water adds up over time. And if they had better plans for recycling and reuse from a cumulative impacts perspective, I think that's important. I think that's something else we should explore in what we're reporting and looking at. I'm also interested in further parsing out proximity data. Right now, I think in the cumulative impacts report, we're just saying how many locations are within 0 and 2,000 feet. I think I'm seeing more of these requests than I had anticipated. And I think it's very important that we're keeping track of potentially the 0 to 500. I think this is how it's collected in the Form 2A, 0 to 500, 500 to 1,000, and 1,000 to 2,000. And I actually would like and would be interested in seeing us collecting that data in the cumulative impacts report year over year. It's the same way it's collected in the Form 2A, so that we can see how many times operators are actually trying to put something within how close to RBUs. I am also interested, and this goes to something that Director Murphy brought up, which is I think that 2B is missing some important information that, at least for me as a commissioner, I've been asking for again and again over time. And we've been, I think, fortunate, and then operators have been willing to say, yes, I will report which wells I'm going to P&A, their locations, and the emissions reductions from those P&A and the associated equipment to that. I think it's something that we should add to the Form 2A, and I think that we should be balancing out what I would see as beneficial reductions in emissions compared to the applications that have been put forth. I'm also interested to know how the orphan well program data fits into our cumulative impacts report, and whether or not what's happening over in that program, how many wells are getting P&A'd, and the potential emissions reductions from that fits into our cumulative impacts report. I think I'm also interested in knowing over time statewide total well counts and whether or not those are increasing or decreasing, and related production to those total well counts. I think that's an important kind of very big picture perspective of what's happening over time with our program and with operators. I'm struggling with trying to, sorry, I'm going fast. These all written down. I'm happy to submit them somewhere. The greenhouse gas goals and the role of the commission and the role of CDPHE, and how our piece, what we're doing at the commission, fits into those overall goals seems kind of disjointed to me. I'm interested in seeing if we can figure out how we can reflect in the cumulative impacts report how the oil and gas industry is doing in achieving those goals. But I'm not sure how to put those pieces together and how we could work with the Air Pollution Control Division to kind of reflect that in our report and show progress towards those goals. I'm also interested in working with the Air Pollution Control Division at some point, reflecting and summarizing the results of the aerial and ground-based survey work that the Martinez-Irwin funds funded. I know those are not complete quite yet, and those reports are being finalized, but I think they show some important data regarding what those aerial flyovers or the groundwork showed with particular types of emissions during certain types of stages of production or post-production. I think we probably need to tackle and acknowledge that our baseline is different from the baseline for some pieces that the Air Quality Control Commission is using. So in some instances, they're using a 2005 baseline. And I think what I'm understanding from staff and Director Murphy is we don't actually have 2005 data to create a baseline, to create a 2005. And that might tie back with what is the purpose of the cumulative impacts report, and trying to align with our sister agencies, but understanding that the work that we have or the data that we have might be a little bit different. So we just need to maybe acknowledge our limitations. I am also interested in keeping track of liquids unloading. I think that the actual incidences of liquids unloading has dropped, and I think emissions from that has dropped. I think it's another piece where we suspected that there might have been emissions, but I think industry is kind of self-corrected in this area, and it might be important information to track over time. I have been struggling with how we compare caps, because the information that's collected and what is shared for the cap proposals, it feels like it's hard for us to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges over time. And I wonder if it could be useful for us to look at per well emissions estimates over time, year over year, maybe an average, but then also basin by basin and maybe cap by cap. And that might give the commission a view over time as to whether or not emissions on a per well basis are reducing over time, and if the BMPs that we've been putting in place and CDPG have been putting in place are successful. It might be a good surrogate or an indicator of what's happening with emissions over time. I've been ruminating about whether or not we need a definition for cumulative impacts, but I also think that this is going to come up in the discussion on Friday during the rulemaking hearing, and I think that's something for discussion. And I'm going to stop there because I think that's plenty for digestion, but I think that there are some things we could be adding to our report to make it a little fuller and with some better information.
Thank you, Commissioner McGowan. An excellent 16-point list was just generated. Commissioner Messner, I think you were wise to allow Commissioner McGowan to go first because she had her hands around this topic. I now would recognize Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner McGowan. That was great. Now I really appreciate the information or ideas that you kicked out there. We definitely had some similar ideas. I think incorporating some of the information from the studies that we've funded utilizing the Martinez-Irwin Fund is really important. I think some of that information, even with the not complete presentations that we received over the last couple of months, was pretty impactful for this commissioner. I agree with you around the emissions information and the inclusion of the NOx, and I think that's important. I think generally overall what I'm interested in philosophically is kind of an analysis of net impacts, right? Net increase in impacts and net decrease in impacts. And those impacts kind of revolve around net increase or decrease in certain air emissions, VOCs, NOx, ozone precursors, things like that. Net increase or decrease of wells or facilities, net increase or decrease of overall surface impacts, net increase or decrease of habitat fragmentation, and I'm making some of this stuff up But that's like the gist of what I find really valuable in a cumulative impacts analysis is, as we're looking at a baseline, we're looking at a baseline that would say that, over the last year, over the last 5 years, we've seen either a net increase or decrease or no net increase of certain impacts. And that's the analysis from my perspective of cumulative impacts. And so anything that we can do to kind of analyze that net impact is super helpful to me. But really, some of the things that I'm not sure we've seen is, overall net surface impacts. And so that's really an acreage piece. And we are getting that information, but net increase or decrease in, impacted acres by oil and gas activities. And then net increase. And so that's that surface disturbance piece. And then net increase, decrease of, different emissions that I think are important to a lot of folks. So. And overall wells, but I think we're already doing that. So.
Commissioner Messner, I like the concept of analysis of net impacts. I had a question mark when you said overall surface impacts, but I think you answered my question mark, which was you were looking at it from an acreage perspective. Is that fair?
Yeah, like surface disturbance. So yeah, acreage.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Others with thoughts? Commissioner Ackerman?
I have just a couple. I've had a chance to certainly review the last cumulative impacts report and appreciate the expertise of Commissioners McGowan and Commissioner Messner in helping lead us on this. I just wanted to kind of not introduce anything new here, but throw in my support for many of the points that Commissioner McGowan brought up. I think given the discussion that we certainly are continuing to have, it's important for us to understand the changes in pollutants, both up and down, and the sources of those pollutants. I think that, there could be some consideration to drilling down on the pollutants. For example, in the CAP that we just heard, there was a table that demonstrated that some of the emissions were associated with drilling, as we know, and some of them were associated, some of the ongoing were associated with burners on separators. And so with that kind of knowledge, if we had it to that level, we could start talking about, prioritizing, looking at reducing emissions on specific pieces of equipment, or at least knowing where those emissions are coming from predominantly. I also have been thinking a lot about water and the cumulative impact of the water that's being used, particularly in the DJ Basin, along with the water that's actually being produced in the Raton Basin. I think it's important to kind of keep an eye on what's happening to that water, what its quality is in the case of the Raton Basin, and where that water is going. I also support Commissioner McGowan's thoughts on leaning towards thinking about recycling water and how much of that water is being recycled and how much of it potentially could be recycled. Commissioner McGowan mentioned a couple of times that talking about the purpose of the cumulative impact report. And to me, I think Commissioner Messner hit it straight on, which is if we can narrow down changes over time and certainly see the things that float to the top, we can address the primary conditions that are of concern that raise to the top in that cumulative impacts report. And as we continue to hear, and as the commission has always continued to work on, is that there is a pathway here to addressing cumulative impacts. And I think it's very important, as was pointed out here, that in order to understand cumulative impacts, we need a baseline, and we're establishing that baseline now. As Director Murphy said, I don't think we're done with that. I think we need to continue to establish baselines, and I think that the cumulative impact report will help us do that. But as it helps us do that, it also helps drive us towards conditions that need to be addressed and that are possible to be addressed. And so I think within the cumulative impacts report, it might be helpful to have a section of, salient points from year to year that were noticed that were, different from previous years or confirmed or changed trends from previous years, and helped kind of, summarize the overall primary findings of the report. So those are my my primary first-time comments, Mr. Chair and Madam Director. Thank you.
Commissioner Cross?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Murphy, for the presentation. It was helpful. And also thank you, Commissioner McGowan, for going first. I do agree with a lot of the sentiment that you provided there. A couple quick notes of items that have been discussed, one of which is I like the idea of talking about the offsets of the plugged and abandoned wells. I think even building on that, I think it's also important to talk about the offsets from decommissioned facilities, and not specifically kind of pigeonhole that into just the wells, because the facilities are where a lot of the ongoing emissions continue to occur from. So I believe that's important as well. And I think just on kind of a bigger note as well, I think that, going through and kind of explaining some of the difficulties in looking at, especially with respect to things that we can try and collect data on, but we may not be able to yet know some of the data of what has been collected, because this is in its infancy, I think is an important note here, and I appreciate going over it, because I think it is something that will probably be coming up tomorrow as well when we have that hearing, because it is difficult to try and say, okay, we have this new rule in place, we have this new report in place, but trying to understand the impacts of it is hard to do this early on. And so I do appreciate the kind of going into detail on that today. And finally, one thing that I'll definitely be curious of when we're seeing it is, and I know it's come up in some of our prior discussions, is kind of the estimates versus what's reported in terms of, are we significantly overestimating? I know that we have a lot of concerns with people wanting to say they give, the worst case scenario of what estimates may be. And if it is drastically different than what's actually being evaluated and what's being collected, then I think that's something that we need to be take into consideration moving forward to try and make sure that we have as accurate of estimates as possible, because I think it's important to provide quality estimates as well, moving forward. So that's more editorial thoughts, but thank you for the presentation.
Commissioner Ackerman?
Mr. Chair, sorry for the second shot at it here. I did fail to mention the wildlife mitigation data that we've included in the first, or intended to include in the first report. There wasn't data to include, but we did note the data in the report, and specifically also stated in our report that there would likely be as we actually collect mitigation funds and expend mitigation funds, that there would likely be a standalone report from CPW associated with that. I just wanted to put a pin in that and state that may be the best approach. It also may be the best approach to go ahead and include that data in this cumulative impacts report as well, depending on the the amount of that data. And so as we produce that this year, Madam Director, I would just say maybe we can make a judgment call as to whether it's appropriate to include it in the cumulative impacts report without a standalone report.
Very good. Great work on behalf of all the commissioners. Great work on the behalf of the staff here. Director Murphy, I think you got what you were looking for, which is a lot of really good additional direction for the next steps, next issues, et cetera.
If I may, Chair, can I distill down what I've heard and what I think a path forward looks like?
Please.
Okay. So I've tried to break commissioner concepts into two categories. One that I feel confident we can execute on for the report on 2022, and one that is going to require a more detailed look at changing either how we collect data, whether we collect the data, how we want to engage on a particular topic. And that will probably be something for a follow-up conversation, maybe in January, or maybe we do it co-extensively with providing the 2022 report. But I think that there are 6 topics from this conversation where I would like clear direction from the commission to include in the 2022 cumulative impacts report. The first is on plugging in abandonment and spud activities. The second is including NOx. The third is including the proximity data to RBUs within 2,000 feet, kind of that sub breakdown that Commissioner McGowan mentioned, including statewide well counts. Production is a little bit tricky because our production likely will not, our final tally of production doesn't usually occur by February. So I don't know if we just want to include, and I might need a little bit of wiggle room on that, but something along those lines, or we, submit an updated report once that's final. An inclusion of the orphan well discussion, and then an inclusion of wildlife compensatory mitigation. For items 5 and 6, the orphan wells and the compensatory mitigation, I would like, a green light to give it a good college try on what to include, recognizing that we could refine it kind of to Commissioner Ackerman's point on wildlife, try it on, see what it looks like, and see if we're gathering the right information and providing it to you all in the right format. But I think those 6 items are actionable for the report due in February. And forgive me, Commissioner McGowan, I didn't capture individually probably every single one of yours, mostly because there's a conversation, sorry, for the second tranche of asks, areas where I think staff needs to evaluate whether we can change how we collect data to effectuate gathering the information, or whether we need to have a more robust conversation. I have 7 topics, and that reflects kind of probably crunching some of the questions Commissioner McGowan raised about emissions into a single topic called APCD, AQCC reporting. There's a lot of information coming in around emissions, and trying to line up what's coming in and what it is a pretty meaty topic. But my 7 items on that list were looking at produced water, whether it's recycled or disposable, which feels like very much a data collection question. Talking about Commissioner Ackerman's point about water quality, that's a little bit stickier. I would need a little bit of guidance. I think we need a further conversation about what we're trying to gather and what it looks like, and then whether we can automate that in a way that makes it effective. The second item was a greenhouse gas roadmap, and where are we in that? How I've been trying to approach that question with this commission is trying to have briefings from the Air Quality Control Commission, the climate group, and we could even think about perhaps another joint meeting with the Air Quality Control Commission to understand what that conversation is, instead of necessarily pulling it into our report. As we developed Rule 904 in the fall of 20, we had a lot of ongoing conversations with APCD staff or the Air Pollution Control Division staff about what information would be fairly readily available from them that we could pull into our report to answer some of these questions without duplicating effort. After our Rule 904 came into effect, Air Quality Control Commission formalized some of that reporting structure that would then come into our report. And so we might want to take a look in February about what that looks like, and see if the right information is being generated and can be pulled together comprehensively without, and then decide what additional analysis, data collection, et cetera, would be appropriate. I think getting a review of the aerial and ground-based survey work by CDPHE, I think if that's an ongoing work product, that's something we could continue to report out about. If it will kind of need to adjust based on, I think, what activity is being done in that space. Liquids unloading, I think we should again do that in coordination with CDPHE, given some of their reporting requirements. The CAP versus OGDP data is a tricky one, and I think comes back into that, like, how are we gathering information, and is there a better way to gather information so that we can then line up information maybe with the same denominator, right? Whether it's per acre, per well, per whatever, but make it, normalize it. Surface disturbance, this has been a popular topic. We've wanted to look at something like this. I think I'm not sure we've found a way to actually gather the information about existing impacts, Commissioner Mesner, versus future, and the data cleanup that it would require has been an ongoing conversation, and could be worth having an ongoing conversation, but that's in there to me just because we don't have a really clear picture of historic disturbance or current state pre-2021 disturbance. So that's my kind of thoughts on what we can immediately implement, and then what might require more guidance or conversation.
Follow up from commissioners, Commissioner Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And one comment I forgot to make earlier, with respect to the plugging and abandoning versus spud wells, I think that's also important, not just with what we talked about before with the offsets, but I think there's obviously a lot of plugging and abandoning going on that is separate and distinct from new development. And so I think that's also an important thing to discuss as well, because it goes beyond that. So I completely agree with it.
Commissioner Ackerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to respond to Director Murphy's comment about quality, it's likely an underdeveloped discussion at this point. And so my thinking is that are we able to recycle water out of the DJ Basin that's then usable for a variety of purposes, or is it only usable for one or two purposes, or is it usable for no purposes? Kind of gives us an idea of maybe what to be able to optionally do with that water. I also, on the other side of the coin, was thinking from the Raton Basin, where there is a lot of shallow, potentially agricultural use water being produced. Is there a way to put that to beneficial use that in conjunction with the with CDPHE that we're not currently seeing? So probably not necessarily something to include right away, but maybe something more for a conversation going forward.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two quick questions. One's a comment, and Commissioner Ackerman and Commissioner McGowan. I mean, some of the questions that you're bringing up there are questions that the Produced Water Consortium ultimately would hope to answer and be able to present that information to the commission and other people that would be interested, which would be, issues around beneficial utilization of water outside of the oil field, recycling and reuse of water within the oil field, and then some legal and policy challenges associated with produced water. And so this is a really important conversation, and I think it can then incorporate into our cumulative impacts discussion. But I think it also could be a separate report to the commission about the findings from the Produced Water Consortium as well. And so happy to do that both ways. And then my other question is, I appreciate some of the challenges around surface disturbance. I think I would like to see further conversations around that and see how, if there are ways that we can continue to analyze that, because the net increase or decrease of surface impacts has a lot of different implications, and I think is a good thing for us to try to analyze. But also, and this is a question for Commissioner Ackerman, as we look at kind of cumulative impacts around habitat fragmentation, is that information that CPW is already kind of analyzing and tracking, understanding that habitat fragmentation can happen not just from oil and gas activities, but lots of different activities, including recreation and other, other land uses.
Commissioner Ackerman.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner Messner. I was pondering that a bit when I read the first report as well. And the short answer is Not really, not at a base level. I mean, from a larger level of migration corridors and large habitat fragmentation, certainly the division is aware and focused on certain areas within the confines of the examination of certain species. But as far as a large global fragmentation tracking mechanism, there isn't one. So I do think that, some type of tracking associated with a finite impact like we're looking at, that's pretty focused, I think would be helpful to their overall discussion if we're able to I mean, we're certainly already tracking acres disturbed versus acres reclaimed. But I think that, if we could work together with them and talk about some metrics associated with habitat fragmentation, I think would be helpful both for our mission and for theirs.
Great, thank you.
Any final thoughts from anybody?
Chair, am I good to kind of proceed with the 6 identified and come back to the other 7 to 12 topics in a more meaningful way?
Thumbs ups?
Okay.
You're good.
Great. Thanks all. I appreciate the input and the opportunity.
No, thank you for your leadership on this, Director Murphy. Okay, it happens to be 10:45, which is the time that we said we would come back. Let's do this. Let's take 5 minutes and come back at like 10:50, and I'll try to wrangle the other folks back into the panel. Okay, the recording is in progress, so we can get started again. Perhaps I could call upon Hermit Manager Ms. Trask to provide us with some perspective of what was accomplished or not during the time that we were on our different topic.
Yes, thanks, Chair Robbins. We had a really good, productive conversation, and I think staff and PDC is very aligned now going forward. Mr. Lepore, if you're able to share your screen with our revised BMP language, we might take an opportunity to walk through a couple of small improvements that have been made. Can you possibly make that a little bit bigger on your screen for us? Wonderful, thank you. So I wanted to point out the 4th BMP down, it's largely in purple. If an OGDP is approved more than 3 years, okay, so this is a new sort of we took the struck through BMP just below that, and we basically created a new BMP that I think both PDC and staff is good to go with. So I'll just read it out loud. If an OGDP is approved more than 3 years before construction of an associated oil and gas location, to wildlife high priority habitat maps or other wildlife habitats such as eagles' nests. And so this gives us an opportunity through Rule 301C, which describes how an operator can make changes to their approved OGDP. So generally, PDC would submit a Form 4 sundry to the Commission with any updated information regarding the situation on the ground for that given location. Staff then would respond to that sundry by saying, we would require X, Y, and Z information before operations could go forward. And so this allows both PDC some flexibility and the commission some flexibility as well, in the timing of OGDP submittals, in the timing of operations, such that if any significant changes were to occur in the interim, they would be addressed cooperatively, collaboratively between staff and PDC prior to the commencement of construction. So staff is comfortable with this BMP. I believe that PDC and staff together reached consensus on this particular language. And then another new BMP that was added is the next one. It's where the cursor is blinking and it says, PDC will commit to submit the Form 2B with the subsequent OGDP submittals within the Guanella CAP. PDC verbally confirmed with staff during our technical review that they would do this. They did include this in, I believe, the final slide of their hearings presentation. And so now we've just memorialized it with the language of this proposed COA here that staff agrees to.
Thank you for that summary, Ms. Trask. Okay, so I'm going to try to minimize my screen a little bit so I can see my fellow commissioners. Do commissioners, or first off, Director Lepore or Mr. Lepore, do you desire to comment from PDC's perspective?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will ask, well, first let me say that I concur with Ms. Trask that it was a productive 45 minutes. We also talked with Ms. Trask and Mr. Andrews about the director's recommendation as it relates to preliminary siting. And I'm going to ask Ms. Trask to share with the commission what she expressed to us.
Ms. Trask?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Lepore. I did express that staff specifically did not recommend approval or denial of PSA in the director's recommendation because we don't believe that the rules required that the director makes that determination. That is up to the commission. However, staff does feel that the ALAs that have been provided with this CAP application are good ALAs, and they do indicate that based on the information provided in the CAP, there is no expectation of staff that any of these locations should be moved or recited at this time. That's not to say that 5 years from now, we might not want to revisit that. And so staff's intent with the director's recommendation and based on the review of the ALAs provided in the CAP application, staff's intent is not to seek any reciting or relocating of any of the 22 proposed oil and gas locations in this CAP application. The sundry that we have just described at the top of the page there on the screen gives us the flexibility that if things do change on the ground, if suddenly, within 6 months prior to construction, now there's, 55 new RBUs within 2,000 feet of one of the proposed locations, this sundry gives staff the opportunity to seek or require an additional ALA, and certainly opens the door for potential discussions about reciting or relocating a location that has been approved by an OGDP. So again, just to reiterate, staff is not intending to have any of these proposed locations moved at this time. We do, however, want the flexibility, as is described in this COA language proposed here, that if significant changes do happen on the ground after an OGDP is approved, we will revisit the potential for an ALA at that time.
And Ms. Trask, if I could just ask, the language that we crafted during the break that's on the screen satisfies staff, addresses your concern about the possibility of future ALAs or whatever else happens in the future. This works for you.
It does. Thank you, Mr. Lepore. Specifically calling out Rule 301C. Again, that is changes to an approved OGDP. So if PDC determines that there are updated cultural distances, updated numbers of RBUs, updated high priority habitat considerations, those would be flagged in that sundry. And Rule 301C allows the director to require any additional information, really including an up to an amended OGDP. So we do have that opportunity. The language as crafted here does satisfy staff's intent that if we need to make significant changes to the OGDP in the future based on changes on the ground, we have the ability to do so.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Trask. Commissioner Messner has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the work that has been done here. So I'm asking this to both PDC and Ms. Trask. So if an OGDP is approved more than 3 years before construction of an associated oil and gas location, PDC will obtain an approved sundry notice from the director updating cultural distances, CPW consultations regarding wildlife, Rule 301C consultation. So I go over to Rule 301C and it says that you can't actually request any of that information unless there is a change to the OGDP. So it doesn't say that if situations on the ground change, or there's additional, there's 350 RBUs inside of 2,000 feet, or there's 55 bald eagles nests, that doesn't change the OGDP, that changes the sites on the ground. I'm not sure how 301C actually gives you the ability to ask for those consultations or that additional information, because the operator is not changing the OGDP. The sites on the ground are different.
Chair, if I may.
Yes.
Staff's approach to Rule 301C has been very conservative. So a change to a Form 2A that was approved as part of an OGDP. A simple or single change to that Form 2A, such as the addition or the revision of a single BMP, that has occurred through this Rule 301C process, where the operator would submit a sundry and say, this is what we want to update on our Form 2A. That sundry gets posted to our website for 14 days. Staff works with the applicant to determine what additional information is needed and what actually is required to accommodate that change. In some cases, it will be simply submitting an additional sundry that literally makes those changes on the Form 2A. So in this case, our intent is that PDC would submit a sundry to us and say, we have updated cultural distances, we have updated wildlife HPH information, we have an updated consultation that we've done with CDP with CPW, because now there's a new bald eagle nest, within a half mile. So the sundry will be submitted to describe any changes that would need to be made to the Form 2A. We are asking for them to submit the sundry to describe any changes that are on the ground. The response then is that staff will approve that sundry with a suite of COAs. Those COAs then might include submit a sundry to update these BMPs, or submit a sundry to give us a new ALA to consider. And so it's sort of a two-step process. It's a little bit, the language in Rule 301C to make changes to an approved OGDP is a little bit, maybe a little bit clunky, and I apologize for if I sound like I'm insulting the commission's previous work. It's not a simple process, but we can simplify the process by approving that initial sundry with COAs that say, okay, PDC, now you need to give us a new ALA and you need to improve your BMPs and you need to do these things before you can commence construction. And so it's not really this submittal of that initial sundry notice as described in this language. It's the result of staff's review of the changes that are being proposed. Commissioner Messner, again, to your point, no changes might be proposed, but really what they are changing in the OGDP, sort of the initial trigger, is that there are updates that need to be provided on the Form 2A to keep the Form 2A accurate with what's on the ground. So if now there's 100 RBUs, they would need to change that data field in the Form 2A that says now there are 100 RBUs within 2,000 feet. So it's an initial assessment of what has changed on the ground, and then it's staff's COAs after that assessment that really would implement the augmentation of information that we would need going forward to make a decision on whether or not the location is still appropriately cited, or whether the location would require an ALA. If a subsequent ALA is required, then that opens the conversation further to say, is there a better location? Is this proposed or this approved location now no longer the best location, and now we would want the location to be moved? That would be determined through a subsequent ALA, and that would then evolve into potentially an amended OGDP with a subsequent hearing by the commission to determine whether that change was appropriate or not.
Okay, so I understand. I mean, the bottom line is that the requirement to submit a sundry notice, if an OGDP is approved more than 3 years before construction, is what triggers Rule 301C. Mr. Lepore, would you agree with that?
I think so. I was following Sabrina most of the way. I mean, I think what we're saying is, if that happens, if it's more than 3 years, we will consult. And the way that they have told us to do that is through 301C. And we're good with that.
And the actual action of submitting the sundry notice triggers everything within 301C. So it triggers a change. And that's, to me, that's important that PDC understands that, because I don't want to get into an argument 5 years from now that you didn't make a change, you're just submitting a required sundry notice.
I think we are on board with that.
Right. And for the record, I'm noting that all the PDC folks' heads are nodding up and down in an affirmative fashion.
And we're being videotaped.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, further questions from commission to either Ms. Trask or the panel about anything before we close the record? Commissioner Ackerman?
Thank you, and I'll put you on the spot a bit here, Mr. Trask. Thanks so much for working with PDC on the fly. It's been very, very helpful. In the director's recommendation, then, we have a recommendation that includes, I think it was 7 preliminary location concerns, and a recommendation to approve preliminary siting for a number of sites, but not those sites in question. Was this discussion, did this touch on that issue at all? And is staff more comfortable pursuant to this discussion moving forward with preliminary siting, or did those concerns remain on the part of staff?
Thank you for the question, Commissioner Ackerman. We did discuss this. And again, I wanted to just clarify that in the director's recommendation, staff did not specify a recommendation to either approve or deny preliminary siting approval. Rule 314 does not require the director to make that determination, but rather just make a determination on the cap as a whole. So I'm a little hesitant. I'm not the director. I'm a little hesitant to speak on her behalf here. So maybe Julie could, sorry, Director Murphy could jump in if possible, but staff is, again, staff is content at the time being with the ALAs provided in this cap. We are not seeking to request moving any of the proposed locations, including the locations that are flagged in red in the director's recommendation. I do feel that additional information that we will receive with the OGDPs will further solidify staff's determination whether or not those locations are adequately protective. But for this particular snapshot in time, the information as provided in the current ALAs, we think is good information, and it sufficiently demonstrates that there are no other alternative locations at this time that are more protective than the proposed locations. That's not to say that these locations are totally protective. We can't determine that until we review all the information that will be submitted in the OGDPs. Does that answer your question, Commissioner?
Yes, it sure does. I'm sorry, I'm having some device issues that keeps cutting off, but I think I'm back now. So I heard all of that, and it does answer my question. I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you.
Did you want to weigh in further, Director Murphy?
I would just underscore kind of the closing 10 words or so from Ms. Trask, that staff continues to believe that these are protective, are the best locations, and with additional information we would understand more about making them adequately protective in compliance with the rules, which is the information that comes in at the OGDP phase.
Okay. Other commissioners with questions? All right, seeing none, I want to thank staff as well as PDC for the good work in developing the refined BMP language that we have on the screen now. And we will move into deliberations. Before doing that, I believe that it is appropriate to close the record. AG Davenport, is that accurate?
Mr. Chair, if the commission is satisfied it has all the information it needs to make a decision, then yes, closing the record would be appropriate now.
Does any commissioner need more information, or if not, do we have a motion to close the record?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion to close the record and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, the record is closed. With that, we will move to deliberation. If I could ask the PDC folks to unvisualize, if that's a word, then I'll be able to see my commissioners a little bit better. Great. Okay, I've got all 5 of us now. So the record is closed. We have taken the information and evidence and witnesses. We have reviewed the files. It is time to deliberate. Commissioner Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I don't always like to go first in deliberations, but I think it's important for me to go first on this because I do want to ask some questions to my fellow commissioners as we go through this deliberation. I did try and use some of our breaks earlier to try and organize my thoughts. So hopefully this is a little bit better prepared and not rambling overall. I think at the forefront, I just want to say thank you to both staff and to PDC for the work put into this. We've been over the fact that this is a very large cap. There was a lot of materials provided. A lot of work has gone into this over the last few years. And so the time and effort put into this by the operator and by staff to have numerous meetings, to talk to Weld County, I think is exemplary, and I appreciate the efforts to get this done. The second thing I'd like to comment on is some of the public comment. I want to first say I appreciate the vast amount of both written and oral public comment that was given in this. I've said in the past, I think it's important that we do get all stakeholders' views on this, not just those specifically within the CAP area, but those outside as well. And as we've talked about before, I think we got a good balance of both comments for and against this. And so I do appreciate the differing views on it. I do want to make a couple comments about some of the public comment that was received. And that's really with respect to two of the comments that were given. One of them was a comment that came in saying, we already all know what's going to happen. This is just rubber stamping. They're just, I believe the exact words were just ticking the boxes. And with respect to another public comment, before we even got done with the presentation by the operator, emails were sent out saying the CAP is well on its way to approval. And so I know I've specifically discussed this before, but given those kind of comments, I just wanted to touch base on it again. And I don't want to speak for other commissioners, but I've had significant questions concerning the siting of this CAP, the receptors at issue, and the operations, all of which were critical to my consideration of approval of this CAP. And I also think that it's important to note that I read through all the written comments, and I still wanted to make sure that I listened to all the public comments as well. And as was evident through the questions provided by the commissioners as this went on, I asked questions about many of those public comments, both in written and in oral comments. And so the insinuation that we as commissioners are just rubber stamping this is not only blatantly wrong, but I find disrespectful as well. Just as staff and the operator put a lot of work into this, we spend a lot of work in this as well. And so the idea that we're not taking into consideration the public comments made, taking in consideration the presentations made, I just have a significant problem with. And so I just wanted to make a note of that, and really make sure that everyone, all stakeholders know that we take this very seriously and nothing is predetermined here. Next, I'd like to talk about kind of cumulative impacts and the BMPs generally. We talked a little bit about the fact that there's going to be a lot of focus on cumulative impacts tomorrow with the proposed rulemaking that's coming before us. And I just want to say that I think this CAP in particular was a great example of how we as a commission and our rules are doing a good job of taking into account our legislative mandate to evaluate and address cumulative impacts of oil and gas operations. And I think that's evident, one, with the way the statement of basis and purpose is written. The CAPs are particularly a great way of evaluating and addressing cumulative impacts. I think here we're seeing a large CAP that you're going through a landscape level planning of looking at operations, you're looking at wildlife protections, you're looking at water, you're looking at infrastructure building, you're looking at plugging and abandoning and decommissioning facilities, and trying to make sure that you're taking all these different things into account. And PDC here has created a landscape level plan that looks at these impacts on different receptors, both direct and existing impacts. And as you look through the presentations given and the information that was provided, we're seeing a net benefit to the cumulative impacts. And I think that really shows how not just evaluating, but also addressing that. We're seeing a decrease in the overall surface disturbance because of the plugging and abandoning of just the PDC wells, legacy wells, in addition to the 289 that they're getting ready to consider with other operators as well. You're seeing decreased emissions, VOCs, HAPs, and everything else, because you're getting rid of some of these legacy wells that don't operate in the same way. I think you're seeing decreased RBUs, or the number of RBUs that are within a close proximity to legacy wells being decreased. And I think that also sticks out as something that we want to highlight. And it's not just that we're worried about new development being close to RVUs, but we're also making sure that protections are given for those that already exist. And I think on top of that, we're also seeing that not just the BMPs that I'll talk about here in a minute, but I think also the fact that the operator is willing to commit to coming back, talking to local governments, talking to the commission, and through the discussions we're having of saying, listen, if 3 years down the road, we're going to have technological improvements, we're willing to talk and we're willing to put those into effect. We talked about their pilot program for looking into the potential electrification of fracking as well. And that's not something they're ready to commit to at this point in time, because they haven't tested it out and see if it's going to be operationally feasible, but it's something they're trying out and something they're willing to come back to us to. And so I think that's important as well. That's it. With respect to the specific BMPs, I think that the BMPs, as with many of the BMPs that are provided by operators and us, are very protective of public health, safety, welfare, environment, and wildlife resources, above and beyond what we actually require. I think when you look at the fact that they're committing to electric drilling, I think when you look at the fact that they're committing to piping oil, gas, and produced water, when you look at the community outreach that's being done, the fact that the operator is looking at wildlife mitigation on a comprehensive level and still agreeing that they're going to talk to us at the OGDP level for additional protections and additional BMPs with respect to some of the site-specific issues, dust, noise, things like that. But when they also have that comprehensive plan, I think that's very good, and it goes above and beyond. And so I was very happy looking through some of those, seeing as talked about, the decreases in emissions from things like the electric drilling, from the number of truck trips that are going to be reduced because of the oil, gas, and produced water takeaway. I think those are very important. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the locations themselves. First and foremost, I appreciate that there was numerous changes to the preferred locations that the operator provided. A lot of it was discussed, when they went into the pre-application meeting with Weld County, I think they said 47 different people attended that pre-application meeting from a variety of different consultation purposes. They spent all day long talking about, here's some of the different issues, here's why we have preferences, here's things we want to change. And between that and future meetings with staff and consultations, they went from the initial 33 locations that they wanted to do when it was an SRC plan to 25 with the pre-application, and now we're down to 22. Some of them they talked about, listen, we're even kind of pushing the bounds of our limits with 3¼ mile drilling to try and make sure that we're doing this, to try and make sure that we're decreasing the impact on receptors. And I think it says a lot that, yeah, they had preferred locations, but you know what, their preferred locations are not going to go through if it's not going to be approved by Weld County, if it's not going to be agreed to by COGCC, by CPW and some of these others. And so I think that is important. I also appreciate, especially the comments that have come out this morning to clarify that staff agrees that these are likely the best locations out there. I do agree that there are still some questions, and I'm going to get into that in a minute with some of these locations about whether it's protecting as much as possible. But I do agree that the alternative location analysis that was done was thorough, especially given some of the surface owner issues. And I think that throughout, I think there's several places where it was acknowledged, it might have been easier to just move this to the neighboring property's owner, but the neighboring property owner did not want it there. They had other plans. And I think that, that's their prerogative, and obviously trying to work within those bounds makes it very difficult. The fact that there was taken into consideration working with farmers about their pivots, I think was also very important. Sorry. I apologize. But I think the fact that they were taking into account farmers' pivots, surface owners' desired developments, et cetera, was very important. And they did take all steps into account to try and reduce the number of RUBUs, to try and address the other receptors that are being impacted here. And specifically with respect to some of the concerns that staff had, I know one of the main issues was the increased number of RBUs compared to what we've previously approved in the past. And I know everything is looked at on a case-by-case basis. And I think one of the things that sticks out is the one OGDP that has been denied in the past had, I believe it was 87 RBUs nearby. We've obviously approved less, and there's some locations here that are in the middle. And while there's no bright line of what's approvable and what's not, it really depends on the case by case and the BMPs. I do know that that was of concern. And just a few points with that. Again, I think looking at the alternative location analyses that were done, I agree that these are the best locations based on the information that we have. And I think number two, the detailed work done on community outreach, I think shows that the RBO owners are aware of what's happening and amenable to this development. And again, I commend the operator on the desire to continue that community outreach, because I know that some of my fellow commissioners have also expressed in the past, we don't want to have this outreach done and then tomorrow they stop talking to everyone in the area. And so I think the BMPs to continue to talk to people is important. Number three, I think, as mentioned, I think that the BMPs that are being proposed here that we've discussed are very thorough. I think they protect the receptors on all levels, from emissions to wildlife to the RBUs nearby, the water, et cetera. I think that's very helpful. And then fourth, I think providing the preliminary siting approval in conjunction with the signage that was discussed, I think is also important. Because as we talk about looking back on this, is if additional RBUs come in, if there are changes, if there are additional nests, I think one of the things that's important in what we talk about is that if people do move into this area, they understand with the signage that this is a future development site, that this is likely going to have oil and gas development here. It is going to have a facility here. So it's not something that's going to be a surprise to people coming into this area. And so I do think that the preliminary siting approval in conjunction with that signage, as you proposed here, is an important aspect. And so last, I just want to touch on what I think is my biggest remaining question. And this is really why I wanted to go first and get the viewpoints of my fellow commissioners on this. And that's the Denali site and also the bypass site, because I think over the last 2 days, one of the things that has stuck out to me is in listening to our experts, there's kind of the hard science and the soft science. The soft science, as Commissioner Ackerman said, is there some of the additional protections, the sound walls to provide may be helpful as the wildlife is used to some of these disturbances, it may help. But really what the hard science says, at least with respect to eagles, is that avoidance is really the only way to do it. It's not something that can be mitigated otherwise. And so I think that hearing what our experts say, this kind of leaves us with, I think, 4 options for these sites. Number one is, as talked about, the simultaneous drilling outside the timing and step. So if we have 2 rigs, one being electrified, they said they wouldn't be able to feasibly do 2 electric rigs, so one would be a dual fuel, which obviously has its own cons because we're no longer getting all the benefits of the electrified drilling. Option 2 is the stage drilling outside the timing, but as Mr. Cocchiere described, this may leak into the timing stipulations. And so then we potentially run into some of the problems with the avoidance that's discussed, especially not knowing when the fledging will be complete. The third option is what was described as kind of the 3 to 4 year time period. If they do drilling 1 year at, say, the bypass, then, and then the next year they can do the completions at the bypass and the drilling at Denali, and then having to wait another year to do the completions at Denali, which is one of the things that Mr. Moret described as being preferable. But then we also have the problems of, one, this taking place over a longer period of time, as well as having the issues of the benefits of getting in and getting out as quickly as possible. And I think the fourth option is not necessarily providing the preliminary siting approval now and trying to get additional options, especially with talking to Greeley. But again, as I talked about before, I think I am in favor of the preliminary siting approval, so we can kind of get ahead of the game there and say, these are the best options based on what we have now, based on what we've talked about. I think we will be able to address additional concerns at the OGDP level. We have the ability to do that, and with the commitments given and staff's recommendations, I think that is probably the best path forward. But overall, I think in conclusion, I'm in favor of approving this cap. I'm in favor of the preliminary siting approval. And I think the biggest question I have to my fellow commissioners is, what do we do with the bypass in Denali? Because that admittedly is something that I'm still canoodling. So with that, I'll kind of look to my fellow commissioners for their thoughts as well.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Cross, for the presentation of your thoughts. I thought that was very well done, and I'm in agreement with a lot of what you said. The last question got to a lot of the information that we heard between the dialogue between Mr. Moret and Commissioner Ackerman. Not to put you on the spot, Commissioner Ackerman, but do you want to weigh in with thoughts about that last piece?
You bet. I'm happy to go next. And if it's okay, Mr. Chair, I'll kind of start a little broader and work towards that as Commissioner Cross did as well. So I appreciate the opportunity to weigh in there. I appreciate Commissioner Cross framing the discussion. And, you know, as I've been reading these materials over the past few weeks and participating in this hearing, I keep coming back to the ideal situation. And so ideally, a drilling site doesn't have RBUs within 2,000 feet, which this one does. I'll get back to that in a moment. Ideally, we've electrified drill rigs and operations throughout a large swath of development, which this cap does. Ideally, as we've discussed many times in the past, there are midstream takeaways, not just for oil and gas, but also for produced water. There's a commitment in this cap to do all of those things on every single site. Ideally, sites are tankless and reducing emissions through being tankless systems, and these sites are committed to be that. Ideally, emissions are reduced rather than increased through the development of further sites, and through the reporting that we've heard and read, this cap does that. Through curtailing ozone emissions, we had a significant discussion about at minimum a 58% overall drop by implementing new modern tankless facilities and P&Aing legacy vertical and other horizontal wells, which this cap does. Ideally, a large master planning process such as this one will consult with and receive consensus from, or even approval from, a variety of impacted entities and agencies. We've heard from CPW that they, as Mr. Moret started his comments, thanking PDC for their significant work to protect wildlife in this cap. And we do have the outstanding issue that Commissioner Cross brought up, and we'll talk about that as well. But CPW stated that it supports this approach and finds it to be protective of wildlife specifically. CDPHE also consulted and had an opportunity to provide support for this approach. We heard from the city of Evans significant support, and we also heard as vehement urging from a county official, Mr. Maxey, as I've heard since I've been on the commission, for supporting a CAP master planning process. In addition, ideally, a CAP like this would have broad public support. And while it's not unanimous public support, there was significant support put forward for this CAP. And then ideally, these developments would all be outside of high priority habitat, the majority of which are, and others are cited for mitigation, which is allowed within our rules. And so, Mr. Chair, I wanted to touch real quickly on the RBU discussion first. This development does propose locations that are within 2,000 feet of significant numbers of RBUs. And when I read through the materials, this was my highest flag, my largest concern. Unless I'm mistaken, I didn't hear or see one comment from an impacted homeowner that raised concern about the placement of these wells within 2,000 feet of their RBUs. And significant questions were asked and answered about public input, public notification, both of the county and of PDC. And both of those entities talked about the public outreach that they'd done and targeted outreach specifically to those RBU homeowners. Because of that helps me feel more comfortable with the preliminary siting of these facilities, knowing that at the OGDP level, we'll continue to reach out to those homeowners. And I would task PDC with continuing to reach out to the homeowners with a goal of receiving consent or otherwise support of the well pad locations from the homeowners whose homes will be within 2,000 feet of each development. And with all that, Mr. Chair, I wanted to circle back to your question, which is the Denali bypass site. I appreciate the significant conversation that's taken place here. And I want to say that although I just mentioned it briefly, I do understand the benefits of preliminary siting. PDC pointed this out, Mr. Lepore did in his closing comments as well. And I think preliminary siting enables many of these other things that I've just talked about, the takeaways, the planning, the potential for electrification, and the significant expense and effort that it is to provide the infrastructure to put this CAP in place. I've stated before that I'm generally supportive of CAPs. Certainly have been talking about CAPs in one form or another for 20 years as an important master planning process for oil and gas development. I believe it remains so. I think PDC has done great work here. I think they've done significant work associated with many aspects. It's a very complicated CAP in a very difficult to execute location. And I would commend them for the collaboration that's clearly taken place on many levels in creating this CAP. And so to the Denali bypass site, obviously I was the one that, not the only one, but one of the commissioners that raised concerns about this site. I remain concerned about the placement of the Denali site in direct line of sight of the Eagle's Nest, particularly with the bypass site also being within the buffer zone. I do recognize that it's on the very farthest reach of the buffer zone. And we heard from Mr. Moret his concurrence that so long as avoidance during the timing period can be achieved, he can be in support of this pad placement. And I support Mr. Moret's approach there. I think the discussion had to take place. I think that it's important to protect this Eagle's Nest. I do note that PDC is the one that detected this Eagle's Nest and reported this Eagle's Nest and continues to track this Eagle's Nest in good faith effort. I see their historic tracking of the fledging of the chicks throughout the last season as a very good faith effort in their intention in continuing to protect this nest. So I can support preliminary siting for this nest with the BMP discussion and the response by staff that on the Denali site, PDC will continue to work with CPW and the Fish and Wildlife Service in order to implement best management practices to protect that nest. So all in all, I am very supportive of this cap, Mr. Chair. It is not without issues. I think that the intent of our process is to provide a framework within a cap that can be workable at the OGDP level. I think this does that. I think this provides a great and solid framework. And I expect that there will be significant discussion about the OGDP level. And I'm putting my trust in PDC that if there are differences at the OGDP level, that we'll work together to work those out, rather than rely upon 604B or other assurances that are given through the cap. I think that they've demonstrated the propensity and willingness to work together with staff and landowners and the community, and I have no reason to expect that they won't continue to do so. I think that's all I had on my list at this point, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to provide my initial thoughts.
Thank you, Mr. Ackerman. We appreciate those thoughts and comments. Who would like to deliberate next? Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think most of the observations that I've had are very similar to what Commissioner Cross and Commissioner Ackerman have already said. I guess I am going to echo, it is disheartening to me that folks who are watching our deliberations think that we are rubber stamping or don't take this job seriously and haven't put in a lot of thought and consideration into what these applications look like, whether or not they're protective of public health, safety, welfare, and the environment. It's many hours of reading materials, working with staff, doing on-the-ground site visits. And what I think results in a better application and a better application process. And commissioners all using their expertise and the backgrounds that they have to nudge, push, cajole operators into doing better. And I think it's maybe perhaps a shame that some of the folks who are watching or who want more, and it is their right, and and they should be pushing for more also, but perhaps taking a step back and recognizing what's on the table here, which is an operator that is piping away oil, gas, and produced water. They're building a produced water system to take away the produced water to minimize truck traffic emissions and other emissions that are precursors to ozone because we're in a non-attainment area. We have them collaborating and working with CDPHE and agreeing to the BMPs that CDPHE feels need to be in place to protect public health and the air quality in this non-attainment area. We see an overall, I'm just repeating things that people have said, but this is an application where we're seeing an actual more than 50% net reduction in VOCs, which is an ozone precursor in the non-attainment area. There's a lot that this operator has done to step up to the plate and recognize their place and their responsibility to deal with emissions in the non-attainment area and to deal and work with RBU owners that are within the 2,000 feet. And I think that they've shown above and beyond community engagement. To Commissioner Ackerman's point, we haven't heard from any of the folks who are within 2,000 feet that they have concerns about what the operator is doing or how they're doing it. I think that we're working to ensure that when the OGDPs get to us, they will be the most protective. I'm appreciative of them understanding that this last slice that we could possibly look for reductions is during completions, and I hear them saying that they're going to try to address that when they come to us with their OGDPs. I think that this is an approvable cap, and I think it's better than the other caps that have been submitted to this commission. So I will stop there and say that I do think that this is an approvable cap. And I think that we will have to continue to work in particular on the Denali and bypass locations with the operator to make sure that that high priority, that habitat is being protective. And I think that we've seen PDC saying that they want to work with CPW to make sure that that happens.
Thank you, Commissioner McGowan. Commissioner Messer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for all my fellow commissioners' thoughts. I'll be relatively brief here, which may be unusual for me. But comprehensive planning for me, coming from a land use background, is incredibly important. And, master planning, comprehensive area plans, this is the root of land use planning. And so I really appreciate the concept of comprehensive area plans and looking at landscape level land use considerations, because they do offer the ability for a number of different local governments and entities to understand what's being planned and to plan the necessary infrastructure to be able to really take advantage of the technology and the foresight to do, I think, more than they would be able to do if you looked at it at a smaller scale. And so I appreciate that PDC has taken on the challenge of really master planning their development footprint in this particular area for the next decade in a transparent manner, so that everyone understands what they're proposing, where they're proposing it, what type of infrastructure that they're putting in, and what best management practices they're going to be considering as they look at a really big swath of land. And this is a good thing in land use planning, because it is transparent and people do understand what is being proposed. And the way that landscape level planning works, the way that master planning works, is exactly what we're doing in this situation, which is looking at a comprehensive area plan, which is the big landscape level plan, and then coming through with specific smaller scale plans with more specificity to refine and modify those particular areas prior to construction. And so that's the steps that we're taking here, and I really appreciate that we're engaged in that process and that we've developed a process for that. I do think it's a strong way to analyze, evaluate, and address cumulative impacts. I think it is an important tool. I think it gets utilized in a lot of different scenarios, but I do think it is a way that we can accomplish a portion of our mandate, which is to evaluate and address cumulative impacts. I do think it means that the operator who is proposing those caps actually has to understand that is a mandate, and propose BMPs and sites and facilities within that cap that do manage and mitigate the net impacts of cumulative impacts of their operations. And I think we've seen that here. I think we've got an operator that's minimizing surface impacts. They're minimizing overall well counts. They're minimizing emissions. They're minimizing infrastructure. I really think that there's a net reduction here as proposed in adverse impacts associated with this cap. And I think that's been shown. And I think through the OGDP process, I'd like to trust but verify. So I'd like to see those reductions verified at the OGDP level. But I do believe that what's being proposed here with electric rigs, strong consideration for e-frac, systems. Tankless design, 3-phase takeaway. I mean, the things that we've been talking about through this whole process, but I think that really creates a strong step towards addressing cumulative impacts. And so I do really appreciate that. I'm okay with preliminary siting with the development that has occurred between staff and PDC and the language that's being proposed for the BMPs. Like I indicated before, fool me once and it's on you, fool me twice and it's on me. I feel like 604B2 and some of the preliminary siting associated with CDPs previously, perhaps have been slightly abused or found perhaps tried to find a loophole in order to be able to feel like they didn't have to do the best that they could when it came down to the OGDP level. And I think that this operator, based on the conversations that I'm hearing, do intend to be transparent in providing the best PMPs that are out there at the OGDP level. But for me, it's a trust but verify. And I think that the language that was developed between staff and PDC in the BMPs does that. I think it is a trust but verify step. And so I really appreciate that. I also really appreciate that all the local governments associated within this cap are supportive of this cap. And I think that's really important. The outreach that has gone to local governments, the different local government processes that have gone through are really important. And I think that's important. I think it's also important for those local governments to know that you now, should this be approved, know where these sites are going to be. And that if you approve 300 homes within 500 feet of these locations prior to them being constructed, it's going to be a problem for this operator to be able to develop that OGDP. And so I think that there needs to be constant communication through the 10-year process of this between the local governments and the operator to understand that there are steps that need to be taken and there's planning that needs to be occurred. And those local governments want the certainty of knowing that these are going to be in a certain place, but they also have a responsibility to understand the timing of operations and the timing of land use associated with these. And so I will throw that out there. As to timing steps for ozone, I understand the concern. I think that the electrification of rigs, and I am taking the operator at their word as far as their desire to really implement an EFRAC system, as a way to reduce the NOx impacts associated with this cap as it progresses through. I will indicate to this operator and any other operators listening that the timing steps for ozone in the non-attainment area are coming. And they aren't necessarily coming from the COGCC, but I think that as we look at the downgrading of the non-attainment area, those timing steps are certainly going to be something that is going to occur. So I would have some consideration in your scheduling around that. I will note that I appreciate the CDPHE consultation for every OGDP. I think that will be important, and I think that that's something that we should formally request from CDP on every OGDP, and that consultation should include verification of the emissions info that's being provided by the operator, as well as their calculations for reduction, to make sure that we are comparing apples to apples and that information is verified. And I will indicate that the Denali and the bypass, which are a challenge for me, I'm taking CPW at its word that the avoidance is the most important piece there. And I think there is an opportunity for avoidance utilizing timing stipulations. And ultimately, I will defer to CPW and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on how to best address the avoidance, but I do think it needs to be avoided. I think that's going to be a for sure thing because it is an unmitigatable situation. And so that does need to be avoided. And I think finally, I'll just indicate that, as we review OGDPs, particularly with RBUs associated with them, the strongest path for an operator to be able to mitigate concerns around RBUs that may be closer than 2,000 feet is informed consent. And there's no informed consent that has necessarily been provided in this cap, and that's something that isn't required at the cap level. But at the OGDP level, I think that becomes a really important consideration as an operator moves forward to consider. And so I will support this cap. I do want to share my appreciation to the staff at the COGCC, as well as the staff at PDC for putting together a really well done comprehensive area plan. I know we've had a lot of debate and picking apart some of the work that's been done, but I do want folks to know that generally speaking, this was a really strong effort at a comprehensive area plan that was really, really difficult to put together. And I acknowledge that, and I know that, and I know that the work that's been done on it is really well done. And so, particularly Mr. Coshier, Mr. DeRose, Ms. Chase, I think have done an exceptional job at putting together this cap. And so I think I'll leave it at that, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for those comments. And I can also be fairly brief at this point because I took notes on all the things that you guys deliberated on, and I'm in agreement with pretty much everything everybody said. I think that I want to read one more piece of the SBP. The commission intends to strongly encourage operators to submit caps whenever possible because of the significant benefits that landscape level planning provides for consolidating infrastructure and minimizing cumulative impacts. This cap does that. And I think for folks that are listening in, you should sort of think about the alternative as opposed to this landscape level planning. And the alternative is many of these locations are likely, once they go through just a singular place, are likely approvable. But then we wouldn't get all of the stuff that the commissioners have talked about and the applicant pointed to and our staff pointed to in terms of this comprehensive planning, the infrastructure, the electrification, the tankless, all of that stuff. So looking at it from that vein, I think this, after we've, had 2 days of hearings, this is very much an approvable comprehensive area plan. I appreciate Commissioner Messer's point about the relevant local governments and the proximate local governments being very much on board with this. And I really appreciate Commissioner Messer's point about, putting them on notice that they need, they've got their master plan on oil and gas development for a large swath of their communities. They should plan other uses accordingly so that this master plan can be carried out. I think that's a very important point. With regard to the RBUs, I note in agreement with Commissioner Ackerman that, there are some locations in which there are a significant number of RBUs within 2,000 feet. But again, the record is void of any one of those RBUs having concerns, serious or not serious, with regard to proximity. I asked that specific question of the applicant. And the only one that raised a question about proximity had to do with view, I think. It wasn't really a health, safety, welfare sort of matter. I also look at this globally, and I'm more comfortable approving locations that potentially have more RBUs that are closer when I also know that we are taking care of protective oil and gas development on 52 miles. And that there's a lot of locations in which there are not RVUs. I find it frankly very well done on the part of PDC and our staff that this has developed up with a very, at the end of the day, a very low number of RVUs close to the locations. The testimony was that there were some 5,000 property owners within the cap. And at the end of the day, there's only 149 that are within 2,000 feet, none of whom have complained. I find that to be very informational and a positive development. So with that, I would move approval of the cap with preliminary siting for all 22 locations and with the inclusion of the last draft of the BMPs that we were shown as BMPs that would be part of the cap.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Is there further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. And I found my agenda, and I don't think we have anything else on our agenda today. Mr. Lepore, Mr. Pashala, thank you to yourselves and your presentation. We do appreciate it.
Thank you,
Mr. Chair. Thank you, commissioners.
With that, I would look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second. Before we vote on that, just a reminder, we're going to be seeing each other again tomorrow at 2 to take up the Wild Earth Guardian petition. And so we'll see you then. So with that, all those in favor of adjournment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? See you tomorrow.